The Iron Pirate by Douglas Reeman. The sea's face that morning rose and dipped in an endless, formidable swell. There were no crests, and the deep troughs gleamed in the early light like molten glass. In a few days it would be August, but in the Baltic the dawn air was already like a knife. It was 1944, and for many the 5th year of the war. Had there been an onlooker, he would have been startled by the suddenness of the ship's appearance. First a great shadow, and then with a contemptuous thrust of her high, raked bows she swept through the mist, parting it and cleaving the steep swell with impressive ease. Closed up at their various action stations, as they had been for most of the night, there were some 950 officers and men scattered throughout her armoured hull. At the rear of the open bridge, alone for a few more precious minutes in his Spartan sea cabin, Captain José Dieter Hechler sat at his desk. This was his world, and had been for the 18 turbulent months since he had been given the honour of this command, one of the remaining crack cruisers in the German Navy. In a moment or so, Victor Teil, his second-in-command, would call him on the red handset above the sea cabin's crumpled bunk. Then Hechler would get to his feet, take a quick look round to ensure he had forgotten nothing, and walk to the bridge. They would greet him with varied feelings, relief, doubt, dislike even, but all would accept him as their captain. Hechler was 36, the youngest captain to command such a ship as the Prinz Luitpold, and the responsibility was clear to see in the deep creases on either side of his firm mouth. The red handset buzzed above the bunk like a trapped insect. Hechler smiled and lifted it. It was Teil, as he had known it would be. A man so dependable that Hechler had once found himself searching for flaws and mistakes. Teil reported, 5 minutes to the final change, of course, sir. It would be. Exactly. Hechler replied, Very well, Victor. I shall come up now. Fregattenkapitän Victor Teil, the heavy cruiser's second-in-command, stood on a scrubbed grating in the forepart of the bridge. His booted feet were wide apart so that he could feel the ship rising and slithering down beneath him. He could picture the faces of the intent bridge party on either hand and behind his back, signalmen and petty officers, the massive oil-skinned bulk of Joseph Gudegast, the navigating officer. The youngest officer here on the bridge was Lieutenant José Conrad Jäger, a fresh-faced, green youngster of 19. Apart from training, Prinz Luitpold was his first ship. Teil heard the steel gate at the rear of the bridge open, noted the way the dark figures around him seemed to come to life as the captain entered and touched his cap casually to the bridge party at large. Teil faced him, and recalled suddenly how he had hated this man. Hechler ducked his head beneath the canvas hood which hid the light of the chart table and peered searchingly at Gudegast's neat calculations, bearings, and fixes. Teil joined him by the chart. The shore batteries are there, sir. Our main armament is alerted and will be kept informed of any change of intelligence. From far beyond the hood's shelter, Hechler heard the scrape of steel as the aircraft catapult was maneuvered around ready to fire off the first float plane. Each had a crew of 2, and apart from cannon and machine guns would today be armed with 2 heavy bombs. Thinking aloud, Hechler said, That is the railway station. We are ordered to destroy it. The Russians will bring up reinforcements by that route. We'll give them a headache. He withdrew from the hood and climbed onto the forward gratings to let the salt air sting away any lurking weariness. Teil said quietly, Time, sir. Hechler nodded. Alter course. Full ahead. All engines. 15 minutes later, the ship surged away from the mist to greet the first weak sunlight like an enraged tiger. As the 4 main turrets swiveled soundlessly onto the prescribed bearing, all 8 guns opened fire. The ship lay at anchor in a fjord off the east coast of Denmark. Captain José Dieter Hechler emptied another cup of strong black coffee and glanced around his spacious day cabin. The ship felt at peace as she swung to her cable, and it was hard to believe that they had been in action less than 2 days back. The sentry opened the door, and Teil stepped into the cabin, his cap beneath his arm. Hechler gestured to a chair. It will be quite a while before the Admiral arrives, Victor. Tyle said, "The upper deck is washed down, sir, and the boats are being repainted. The Admiral will find no fault in the ship's appearance." Heckler put on his best jacket and buttoned it carefully. In his mind he could see the Admiral very clearly, one of those round, ageless faces with wide, confident eyes. He smiled. Unless you knew him. He was only a year or two older than himself, and already a rear admiral. One of Dönitz' shining lights, everyone said, highly thought of even by the Führer himself, or so it was claimed. Tyle said, "Will there be leave, sir?" "I expect so. Our people can do with it." "It's not for myself, sir, you understand. We all need a break." There was a tap at the door, and after a small hesitation, the executive officer, Korvettenkapitän Werner Fröbe, stepped inside. Fröbe was tall and ungainly, with huge hands which seemed forever in his way. Next to Tyle, he was responsible for the running of the ship and the supervision of the various watches and working parties. Tyle glared at him. "Well?" Fröbe looked instead at his captain. "I apologize for the intrusion, sir, but there is an officer come aboard from the town." He dropped his eyes. "A major of the SS, sir." "What does he want?" "He wishes to load some stores on board, sir." He held out a piece of paper. "He has the Admiral's authority." Heckler took it and frowned. "It seems in order. Have the boatswain select a party of hands to assist him." Fröbe said glumly, "The Major has some people, workers." Tyle said shortly, "Civilian prisoners, more trouble." Heckler saw their exchange of glances. Civilian prisoners could mean anything in wartime, but with an SS major in charge, it probably meant they were from a labor camp. Deal with it. When Fröbe had left, he added, "The Admiral will be here soon, Victor. I don't want the ship cluttered up with working parties when he steps aboard." Later, Heckler left the cabin and walked along the starboard side, his eyes on the choppy water, but missing nothing of his men who worked above or around him. They respected him. He had brought them back to a safe anchorage, and that was enough. Fröbe stood slightly apart with the SS Major, a man who would have been utterly insignificant but for his uniform and the Death's Head badge on his cap. Something made Heckler pause. He asked, "Is anything wrong?" Fröbe jerked to attention. No, sir. These hands will go ashore to man a lighter and bring it alongside." The Major interrupted. "They must be under my orders, Captain." Heckler glanced at him coolly. "They are also under mine, Major. I will be pleased if you remember that." He glanced at Fröbe. "Make it quick." Rear Admiral Andreas Leitner lay back in one of the cabin's deep chairs and regarded the glass in his hand. "Good, eh?" he chuckled. "I find it hard to admit that only the frogs can make champagne." Heckler tried to relax. Leitner was exactly as he had remembered him, youthful, confident, and so buoyant that it was impossible to imagine him ever being ruffled. He had come aboard with a bounce in his step, and after saluting the quarterdeck and side party had faced the assembled company and thrown up a stiff Nazi salute which had seemed theatrical in spite of his gravity. An act? It was still difficult to judge. Heckler watched him while Perk, his steward, refilled the glasses. Leitner must have brought a dozen cases of champagne aboard, which his flag lieutenant was now having stowed for future use. "You have a fine ship, Dieter. I'm quite jealous the way you are spoken of in the High Command." He waited for Perk to withdraw and said, "I shall hoist my flag aboard very shortly. A private ship no longer. How does that strike you, my friend?" "I am honored, sir." "You are not. I know you too well to accept that." He laughed and showed his even teeth. "No matter. You are the right captain. We shall do well together." "Shall we return to the Gulf, sir?" Leitner became serious. "I cannot discuss it yet." He wagged the empty glass at him and added, "I was sorry to hear about your marriage, Dieter." "It was a mistake." "I can tell by your tone that you blame yourself. I doubt that you have any cause, Dieter. An idealist, yes. A bad husband? I think not." He sighed. "Women are admirable, but never treat them as equals." Heckler relaxed slightly. Another problem solved. Was that how Leitner had gained flag rank, he wondered. Leitner said, "My gear will be sent aboard this afternoon. You have quarters for flag officers, that I do know." Heckler nodded. "Had I known you were coming, sir, I would have had the quarters properly prepared. As it is—" Leitner shrugged indifferently. "Castle or charcoal burner's hut, it is the same to me. We shall dine together tonight. In the meantime, my flag lieutenant will present a brief summary of immediate requirements." Later, at the gangway, before they exchanged formal salutes, Leitner said, "I shall send my car to the pier tonight, Captain. We shall speak of old times." Then he was gone. Heckler nodded to the duty officer. "March off the guard, Lieutenant." He watched them clump away, doubtless thinking of their delayed meal. It was a pity that life could not be that simple for us all, he thought. When he looked again, the launch had vanished around an anchored freighter with the Swedish flag painted on her side. Life would not be quite the same again, he decided grimly. Then, without warning, a muffled explosion echoed against the superstructure and made several seamen come running, their faces taut with alarm. Hrose panted along the deck and saluted. "Captain, the lighter is on fire. An explosion in her engine, I think." "Call away the accident boat at once. Send help." It had been on the way back to the shore after unloading the Admiral's mysterious cases. Hrose watched men running for the main boom beneath which the duty boat was already coughing into life. Then Heckler glanced at the placid shoreline. "I want to know immediately what happened. Everything." He strode away and wondered if the Admiral's launch had seen the explosion, which must have been near the fjord's entrance. In war, you never accepted even the smallest disaster as an accident. 7 days' leave had been granted, but now the men were returning to the ship. There was a tap at the door to Heckler's day cabin, and then Tile stepped over the combing and closed the door. Heckler was glad of the interruption. His table was covered with intelligence files, packs of photographs, and even vague news reports. It was the first time he had seen Tile since he had returned from leave. He looked paler than usual and tight-lipped. Heckler had felt a change of atmosphere throughout the ship when the married men had returned from their brief escape. They might make laws about spreading gloom and despondency, but they could never enforce them, Heckler thought. Tile said, "We sailed this evening, sir. The escorts have already anchored as ordered." Heckler looked at him casually. Tile sounded almost disinterested. It was so unlike him and his constant search for efficiency. "Is everything well with you, Victor?" "Why, yes, sir." "I just thought, how was your leave?" Tile spread his hands. "The usual. You know how it is. A house always needs things." Heckler glanced at the papers on the table, so that was it. An upset with his wife. "Anything I can do?" Tile met his gaze. "Nothing, sir." "Well, then." Heckler looked up as the deck trembled into life. It was a good feeling, the beast stirring after her enforced rest. He said, "Norway. We shall weigh at dusk and pass through the Skagerrak before daylight. I want to be off Bergen in 30 hours. After that we shall keep close inshore and enter our selected fjord to await further intelligence." Tile nodded. "I had expected to see an Admiral's flag at the masthead when I returned, sir." Heckler smiled. "The Admiral intends to keep us guessing, Victor." He thought of the mysterious boxes which had been taken below. All the keys of the compartment where it was stowed had been removed from the ship's office. The Admiral had one key, and Heckler had locked the other in his cabin safe. He was determined to get the truth about them out of Leitner. Tile watched Heckler across the table. Was he really as composed as he made out? He should feel closer to Heckler now. His wife had left him too, although no one had ever discovered the whole truth. Heckler said, "We're going to fight, Victor. I feel it. No more gestures, no more bloody bombardments with barely enough sea room to avoid being straddled. Have you ever read about Nelson?" "No, sir." "You should. The boldest measures are the safest. That's what the little Admiral said. I believe it. Never more so than now. We'll lose this war if we're not careful. Tile stared at him, stunned. "Impossible! I mean, sir, we can't be beaten now." "Beaten? I suppose not. But we can still lose." He did not explain. Instead, he considered Norway. The first part of their passage should not be too dangerous. He thought of the new detection gear which was being fitted. As good as anything Britain and her allies had. The Scharnhorst had been tracked and destroyed with it even in a dense snowstorm. Prinz Luitpold's was supposed to be twice as accurate, and they were the first to have it fitted. Hastily trained men had been rushed to the ship. There was also a new senior surgeon on board. Heckler considered discussing the surgeon with Tile, but decided against it for the moment. The man's name was Stroheim. He was highly qualified and a cut above most naval doctors. Heckler had skimmed through his confidential file. There was a pink sheet attached to it. Stroheim had come to him under a cloud. You could not ignore it. He held a mental picture, too, of Oberleutnant Bauer, the signals and WT officer. Bauer, too, had a special form in his file. He was the ship's political officer, a role which even as captain Heckler could not investigate. Heckler shook his sudden depression aside. "I would like us to walk round the ship before the hands go to their stations for leaving harbour, Victor." He forced a smile. "To show a united front." Tile stood up and grasped his cap tightly to his side. "It will be an honor. For the fatherland." For a moment, Heckler imagined he was going to add Heil Hitler, as Leitner would have done. The Prinz Luitpold's swift passage from the Baltic into Norwegian waters was quieter than Heckler had anticipated. They logged a regular speed of 20 knots and passed Bergen within minutes of Gudagast's calculations. Less than 24 hours after dropping anchor off Bordeaux, Heckler received a brief but impatient signal. He was to fly immediately to Kiel. After the uncertainty and the mystery of his orders, it was something of an anticlimax. But as he was ferried ashore and then driven at reckless speed to the airfield in an army staff car, the choice of Bordeaux as a lair for his ship became all the more evident. Everything was planned to the last detail, as if he had no hand in anything. He did not even know what to tell Tile before he left. He might even be going to Germany, only to be informed he was relieved that perhaps Tile was taking command after all. The aircraft, a veteran Junkers 3-engine transport, arrived at Kiel in the late afternoon. In the underground naval headquarters, Rear Admiral Leitner welcomed him. "Right on time, Dieter." He gestured to another officer, a captain who was vaguely familiar. Leitner said, "Perhaps you know Klaus Rau. He commands Lübeck." They shook hands, and Heckler recalled the other captain, who had once commanded a destroyer during the attack on Narvik. He was a stocky, dark-jowled man with deep-set eyes which seemed very steady and unblinking. Heckler sat down and pictured the cruiser which lay near to his own ship. Lübeck had been in the thick of it from the outbreak of war. She was an old ship, built in the early 30s and about half the size of Prinz Luitpold. Leitner looked at them blandly. "We shall be working together, gentlemen, just as soon as I hoist my flag. It will be a small but crack squadron, and the enemy will have cause to remember us. You will receive your final orders when you return to your commands. This is a maximum security operation." He gave a quick grin like an impish schoolboy. "If it leaks out, I shall know where to come looking, eh?" He glanced at his watch. "We must see the head of operations." Rau stood up. "Until tomorrow, then, sir." He glanced at Heckler. "A pleasure meeting you again." Heckler watched the door close. A man without warmth. Leitner smiled. "He is jealous of you. Nothing like envy to keep men on their toes, He walked to the other door. "Come with me, Dieter. The time for cat and mouse with men like Rau can keep." Admiral Manfred von Hanke was an impressive figure by any standards. He was standing straight-backed in the center of a well-lit map room, his heavy-lidded eyes on the door as Leitner and Heckler were ushered in by another side door. Leitner began brightly. "This is our man, sir." Von Hanke raised one hand in a tired gesture, and Leitner fell instantly silent. Von Hanke said,
"Be seated. This will not take too long."
He pressed a button on his desk, and several long wall panels slid away to reveal giant maps of each of the main battle areas. The straight-backed admiral said in his slow, thick tones,
"The Allies are throwing everything they have into France. Our forces will blunt their advances, of course, and already the army's pincer movements have taken many prisoners and valuable supplies. But the advance goes on. Intelligence reports are excellent. The British intend to do something they have not attempted before, and have 2 convoys in northern waters at the same time. A loaded convoy routed for the Russians in Murmansk, and an empty but nonetheless valuable one on the reverse route to Iceland. The Normandy campaign has made the Royal Navy very short of escorts. Your ship, Captain, is possibly the most powerful of her kind afloat, and she is one of half a dozen major units left in the fleet. At the right moment, you will leave Bordeaux and seek out one of the convoys, and then, Captain, you will take full advantage of the disruption caused, and—" He walked towards him and then gripped his hands in his. "You will take your ship into the Atlantic."
For an instant longer, Heckler thought he had misheard, or that the Admiral was about to add something. The Atlantic? A ship like Prinz Luitpold could create hell on the sea lanes until she was run to ground. Von Hanke said,
"You do not question it?"
He nodded slowly.
"That is good. I would not like to give the ship another captain at this stage."
Leitner exclaimed, "It is a perfect plan, Dieter! A tiger at large, with all the chain of supplies to make it possible." Von Hanke frowned.
"Later."
He looked at Heckler.
"Surprise will be total. It will show the world what we can do. You will do it. For Germany."
A door opened, and Heckler knew that the interview was at an end. Von Hanke folded his arms.
"Nothing will be said beyond these walls. Only the Führer knows, and he will let nothing stand in your way."
Outside the map room, Leitner said, "Return to your ship. I will fly up in 2 days. After that, who knows?" The Atlantic. The vast Western Ocean. The killing ground, where every ship would be an enemy. Leitner's words stuck in his mind. A tiger at large. The waiting was over. A reconnaissance plane had been spotted, and the ship was at action stations. Tyle said between his teeth, "A seaplane replacement is expected, sir." He sounded anxious. "I hope to hell that headquarters have ordered it to stand away." Heckler looked over the screen and past the nearest gun crews as they tried to track the aircraft. "Gunnery officer requests permission to use main armament, sir." "Negative." Heckler knew that Kroll would shoot at anything just to exercise his men, but it was a waste of ammunition, and with as much hope of hitting the reconnaissance plane as a bow and arrow. "Aircraft at green 110, angle of sight 10. The gunnery speaker snapped into life. "Disregard! Aircraft friendly!" Heckler crossed the bridge to watch the float plane as it left the land's protection and followed its own reflection across the flat water. He snapped, "I want to see that pilot as soon as he comes aboard. We may be short of a plane and the man to fly it, but by God I'll send him back double quick unless he can explain himself." If there had been a proper air attack, especially by carrier-borne torpedo bombers, the seaplane replacement would have been right in the middle of it. Moments later, the new float plane made a perfect landing and then taxied towards the anchored cruiser. Tyle dropped his glasses. "Extra passenger, sir. It looks like the rear admiral." Even as the plane glided towards the side, Heckler saw Leitner grinning up at them, before removing his flying helmet to don his oak-leaved cap. He said, "I don't care if it's Christ Almighty. That was a damn stupid thing to do." Followed by Tyle, he hurried from the bridge and down to the catapult, where a side party had been hastily assembled. Leitner pulled himself up from the Arado without waiting for it to be hoisted aboard. He was flushed and excited. and could barely stop himself from laughing aloud at Heckler's grave features. Together they watched the plane being hoisted up the side. Leitner stood with his arms folded, still dressed in a white flying suit, his cap at a rakish angle as he had appeared many times in the newspapers. Heckler watched the pilot and observer climb down to the deck and then said, "I'll see you later. You might have got your ass shot off." The pilot turned and stared at him and then pulled off the black helmet and goggles. Heckler stared as a mass of auburn hair tumbled over the other man's shoulders. The Admiral made a last effort to contain his amusement and said, "Captain, may I introduce Erika Franke, one of the finest pilots in the Third Reich, I believe." She eyed him without curiosity, her lips slightly parted as she shook out her hair from her flying suit. "Quite a welcome, Captain." She did not offer her hand. Heckler looked at the Admiral. "What I said still goes, sir." The girl said, "I'd like to change and have a shower, if I may." She touched her upper lip with her tongue. "Even at the risk of getting my, ass shot off, eh?" On the following evening, the wardroom throbbed with music and was packed with officers and visitors. There were lots of women there, mostly German, except for the wives of some local officials. Heckler stepped into the wardroom and moved through the packed figures. He heard a woman laugh and saw the auburn hair shining beneath a deckhead light. Erika Franke wore neither a gown nor a uniform. It was something in between, dove grey, which set off her hair and her skin. Heckler was still uncertain what to do. Leitner had explained that the orders came from von Hunke and even higher. Erika Franke was to stay aboard. Incredibly, there was also a camera team. Leitner seemed to treat the whole matter like a personal publicity operation. She called, "Why, Captain, so you have come amongst us after all." He said, "I hope you are being looked after, and I apologize for the way I greeted your arrival on board." She touched her lip with her tongue, as she had when she had faced him at their first meeting. "That must have cost you a lot, Captain. I suspect you are not used to bending your knee, especially to a mere woman." Leitner joined them before Heckler could answer. He said, "Good party. It will make everyone believe we are here as a part of a local squadron. Let them all relax and enjoy themselves, eh? Who cares about tomorrow?" Tyle was making signals from the door, and Leitner remarked, "A night full of surprises, as it should be." Heckler glanced past the noisy laughing figures and saw his wife as she stepped over the combing. He felt as if his breath had stopped. Her hair was quite short, so that her small, perfectly shaped ears were visible, as were the pendant earrings, as she turned to look around. Heckler put down his glass. Inga had always commanded a lot of attention, like the first time he had seen her and lost his heart. She had an escort, a much older man in an olive-green uniform. Leitner was watching him, one eyebrow cocked. "She asked to come. What must I do? How could anyone refuse her?" Heckler looked at his wife as she came across, men parting before her or trying to catch her glance. She wore a red silk gown with thin shoulder straps. She presented her hand for him to take and kiss. Even that was perfectly done. Leitner was shaking hands with her escort, but Heckler did not even catch his name. The touch of her hand, the movement of her breasts, which were barely concealed by the red silk, seemed to render him helpless. She said softly, "You look tired, Dieter. Doing too much?" "I was not expecting." "That is evident." She smiled and touched his cheek, but her eyes were quite cool. "No matter. You are a man. A hero, some say." Heckler felt the old anger again. "Why here now, Inga? It's over." "You think so?" She rested one hand on his sleeve and touched the 4 gold stripes. "You need me. You always will. Nothing's changed. Can we talk? In private? Your cabin?" She looked up at him, her eyes steady, her lips shining, inviting. The cabin was quiet. There was some champagne and 2 glasses, as if it had all been planned. She saw his expression and said, "Thank you. I should like some." He could feel her watching as he opened the bottle and wiped it free of ice. She never looked tired. He could not recall her ever refusing an invitation to a party or a reception. Like the time he had returned home with the knowledge he was being given Prinz Luitpold. He had been in bed reading when he had heard her come into the house, then the sound of men's voices. When he had gone down, he had found her in the arms of an artillery major, while another officer was on his knees beside a girl who had obviously passed out with drink. The man had been tearing the clothes off her, stripping her naked, while Inga and her friend ignored what he was doing. Somehow, he could barely recall how, they had made it up. Looking back, he must have been mad, but he had loved her then. Hekla turned with the glasses. He still wanted her. Was that the same thing? She watched his face as if to test each emotion there, and said, "You are sailing soon. Why else would Andreas invite me?" "What do you want, Inga?" She touched his mouth with her fingers. "I need you to love me." The telephone shattered the silence, and she smiled as he reached out to take it. It was Tyle, his voice hushed and troubled. One of the guests had fallen down a ladder. It was someone important. He thought the captain should know. Hekla watched her, the way she smiled as she allowed the red silk to fall about her waist. Her breasts were lovely, and she touched one, her lips parted, knowing it would provoke him. He said quickly, "Get the senior medical officer, Victor." He had not met the newcomer yet, and as he watched the thrust of her breasts, he could barely recall his name. "Stroheim." He put down the phone and looked at her. She was staring at him, her eyes full of disbelief. "What name?" "Karl-Heinz Stroheim. He's new on board. She struggled into her dress and knocked over her champagne without seeming to notice it. Hekla stood up while she looked around the cabin like a trapped animal. "You know him?" She faced him, her eyes hot. "Don't you dare question me! I'm not one of your sniveling sailors! Take me back! I must go!" "Tell me. For God's sake, you said you wanted me." She stared at him, and he could see her self-control returning like a calm on the sea. "What will you do, Dieter? Knock me down? Rape me? I think not. Your precious Andreas would not care for that." By midnight, as the watchkeepers changed round for the next 4 hours, Hekla still walked the decks alone. When he eventually went to his cabin, he saw that the glasses and ice bucket had gone. The stain of her champagne all but mopped up from the carpet. A light burned beside his bunk, some coffee in a thermos nearby. He thought suddenly of the new medical officer and her expression when he had spoken his name. When Perk entered silently to switch off the light, he found the captain fast asleep, still fully dressed. Perk sighed, and then swung Hekla's legs onto the bunk. He smiled with satisfaction and switched off the light. The captain would see them all right. He always had. Hekla slid from his steel chair on the port side of the bridge and stamped his feet on the scrubbed gratings to restore the circulation. He looked past 2 signalmen and saw Lübeck following 1/2 a mile astern, her faint funnel vapour streaming out abeam like her flags. The destroyers, too, were exactly on station, as if they were all on rails. A small but powerful force, he thought, with air cover to make it easier. It had been 16 hours since they had weighed and with little fuss had steamed out of Salt Fjord, soon to lose Bordeaux in the gathering dusk. Hekla had been on the bridge throughout that time. It was a strange feeling to be heading out into an ocean instead of sighting land every so often as in the Baltic. The officer of the watch put down a handset and said, "The Lady Flyer wishes to come to the bridge, sir." Hekla thrust his hands deep into his pockets. He had not seen her since they had left Bordeaux, except once when she had been on the Admiral's bridge with Leitner. Like the 2 girls who were in the camera team, her presence gave a sense of unreality. According to Leitner, they would be transferred before the ship headed deep into the Atlantic. Hekla turned to face her as she was ushered into the bridge. She wore a black leather jacket with a fur collar turned up over her hair. "A wonderful view, Captain." She climbed onto the gratings and peered through the salt-blotched screen. "I should love to fly right now." She gestured towards the upper bridge and radar, Leitner's flag leaping stiffly to the wind. "So huge, you feel as if nothing would stop her, as if she could run away with you." Hekla nodded. When I was a young watchkeeper, I often thought that. Especially during the night, the captain asleep. Nobody to ask. She said, "Seeing those great guns makes me realize what your kind of war is all about." "Are you afraid?" "I don't think so. It's like flying. There are only certain things you can do if the plane gets out of control." She shrugged again. "I don't feel I have any hold on things here." Then she laughed. Tyle appeared at the rear of the bridge and saluted, although his eyes were on the girl. "The Admiral sends his compliments, sir, and would you see him?" "Yes." Heckler was annoyed at the interruption. Being captain usually gave him all he needed, but he craved a conversation with someone who was not committed or involved with the same things. He found Leitner on his armored bridge, leaning with his arms spread wide on the plot table. "All intelligence reports confirm my own thinking, Dieter. Tomorrow we shall meet with the eastbound convoy. The British will know we are on the move. No matter. They will expect us to strike at the westbound one to protect their friend Ivan's supplies, eh?" He nodded, satisfied. "All working out. There are 6 U-boats in this area and round-the-clock air patrols. I can't wait to begin. Into the Atlantic. All that planning and Von Hanke's preparations, God, it makes one feel quite humble." He looked down at his plot table again. "Your second in command, I had a private signal about him." Victor tiled. "His wife has gone missing. Of course, I'm certain it will be all right. After all, ration books, identity cards, a civilian can't just vanish, eh?" Heckler recalled Tyle's face, the way he had parried questions about his leave. Leitner said softly, "I know what you're thinking, Dieter. Don't. He is a good officer, I'm sure, but he is the second in command. Should anything happen to you, well—" He shrugged. "I trust him, sir." "Good. But if he trips up on this mission, he goes. Do I make myself clear?" Heckler nodded. "Very." Leitner yawned. "Pretty girl, that Franca woman, eh? I wonder if she's as good in bed as in the cockpit." Heckler returned to the bridge. He felt strangely disappointed to find she was no longer there. Tyle had gone too. For that, at least, he was glad. "Ship at action station, sir." Heckler returned Korvettenkapitän Fröber's salute and glanced briefly around the bridge. In war, what a short time it took to know their faces, to forget them after they had gone. Everyone stiffened as Leitner entered the bridge and strode unhurriedly to the gratings. Heckler watched him curiously. The whole scheme might go badly wrong from the outset. There had been plenty of examples like Graf Spee and Bismarck, he thought, but Leitner looked very much at ease, even theatrical, with a pure white silk scarf tossed casually around his throat, his rear admiral's cap set at a rakish angle. Leitner remarked, "The stage is set, eh?" Heckler raised his glasses and studied the nearest destroyer. "Signaled the first subdivision to take station ahead." He glanced at Leitner. "Now." A lamp clattered, and Heckler saw a young signalman staring at the admiral with something like awe. He had probably never been so close to a god before. Heckler asked sharply, "What are those people doing here?" Leitner smiled. "My orders, Captain." The camera team huddled by a flag locker, the 2 women looking ill at ease in their steel helmets. Leitner added smoothly, "A record. We must all take risks in war." Heckler watched the camera being mounted and Leitner adjusting his scarf. The flag lieutenant hurried across the bridge and handed Leitner his signal pad. He took his time while the camera purred into life and all eyes watched as the scene was recorded. Heckler thought for an instant it was an act, but Leitner said briskly, "The attack on the convoy was a success. The 1 escort carrier was hit by torpedoes. She is out of the fight. 2 U-boats were destroyed, but they carried out their orders. Brave men, all of them. The British are concentrating on the eastbound convoy, Dieter. Von Hanke is a shrewd old devil. They have a battleship and 2 heavy cruisers as a covering force, but well to the north, as expected." Heckler walked to the rear of the bridge and peered aft past the funnel. The new Arado looked bright and incongruous beside one of the camouflaged ones. Was she really going to fly it as Leitner had vaguely outlined? He never gave the whole story about anything. He thought of the photographs Leitner had shown him prior to weighing anchor. The fjord at Bordeaux, shot from several thousand meters up. Even the camouflaged nets had looked the same. It could have been Prinz Luitpold lying there. But Leitner had explained 2 old supply ships had been preparing for weeks. After this sortie they would be moored together in such a way that any reconnaissance aircraft would imagine the Prince had returned to her anchorage. It was so simple, it was almost ridiculous. But if it worked, it might give them the extra hours they needed. Allman, the lieutenant in charge of bridge communications, handed him a telephone. "Gunnery officer, sir." Even the telephone could not disguise the satisfaction in Kroll's voice. "Enemy in sight, sir. Bearing green 10, range 215. Heckler wanted to turn and look up at the fire control station. The unseen eye reached beyond the empty horizon so that Kroll could already watch the enemy formation at a range of over 21,000 meters. Leitner jabbed his sleeve. "I'm going to my bridge," he grinned. "This is a great day." He brushed past the bridge party, and Jaeger said, "They are almost within range." Frober watched him over the gyro repeater and muttered, "So will we be soon." Heckler raised his glasses and stared past the leading destroyers. Even their wakes were salmon pink, their shining hulls like colored glass. The forward guns shifted slightly, the muzzles high-angled for the first salvo. Astern, Lübeck's gun crews would be ready too, but they would have to be patient a while longer. He wanted to glance at his watch, but knew such a move might be mistaken for doubt, anxiety. Allman asked, "Permission to open fire, sir?" "Denied." He pictured the convoy again. They would scatter if they fired too soon, and there was always the covering force to consider, a battleship and 2 heavy cruisers. "Aircraft, sir!" Several of the men gasped aloud. "Red 15, angle of sight 10. Frober said between his teeth, "Torpedo bombers, for Christ's sake!" Orders rattled out from every side, and the short-range weapons swung instantly onto the bearing. Heckler stood in the corner of the bridge and leveled his Zeiss glasses, surprised that he should feel so calm, almost detached. "Short-range weapons, stand by. Secondary armament—" His eyes watered in the powerful lens as he saw the 2 small dots heading towards the ships. They were so low now they appeared to be scudding across the water. He knew their outdated silhouettes well enough. Swordfish, twin-winged torpedo bombers, like relics from the Great War. He cleared his mind and shouted, "Open fire!" The line of destroyers were already firing, and the sky soon became pockmarked with shell bursts. Allman said thickly, "The Emerald, sir!" Leitner sounded far away. "The convoy may scatter. Increase speed. Signal the group to engage the enemy as ordered." Heckler saw the signalmen bending on their flags and said, "Full ahead. Prepare to take avoiding action." He saw Frober nod. Then he forgot him and the others as the power surged up through the bridge like something unleashed until the whole structure quivered around them. He had to shout above the sharp bang of the secondary armament, which poured acrid fumes over the bridge as the ship swept forward, faster and still faster. "Main armament! Open fire!" He barely had time to adjust his earplugs before both forward turrets blasted the air apart to fire upon the target, which was still invisible below the horizon. He looked for the 2 aircraft and saw them weaving amongst the shell bursts, while bright tracer lifted from the destroyers and crossed their path in a fiery mesh. One of the swordfish was trailing smoke, and it seemed impossible that either of them could survive the barrage. One thing was obvious. Prinz Luitpold was their target. Neither of the swordfish torpedo bombers stood any chance of survival, and each pilot must have known it. As they pounded past the line of destroyers, the one trailing smoke seemed to stagger, as tracer and cannon fire tore into it. Seconds later, it exploded in a vivid orange flash. But the second aircraft was dodging the flak, and even as he watched, Heckler saw the torpedo drop from the plane's belly and make a small feather of spray as it hit the water. The plane continued towards them, rolled over, and then dived into the sea with a dull explosion. "Torpedo running to port!" "Hard a port!" At 30 knots, the cruiser seemed to lean right on her beam, men falling and clutching anything for support as she thundered round. "Steady! Hold her!" Heckler thought he saw the thin thread of white as the torpedo streaked towards the port bow. Leitner's voice broke through the din, distorted and wild on his intercom. "Signal Hans Arnhem to—" He got no further. The destroyer received the torpedo halfway down her port side, even as she dashed protectively between it and the flagship. At full speed, the effect was instantaneous and terrible. Half the forecastle collapsed, and then rose in the air as the ship broke in two, the thrust of her screws driving her on and down as they watched. Heckler said, "Bring her back on course." From one corner of his eye he saw the Lübeck surging past to take the lead into battle. He could picture Rau laughing as he watched the Prince reeling from the line in confusion. The intercom reported dully, "Hans Arnhem has sunk, sir." Heckler snatched up the gunnery handset. "This is the captain. I am turning to starboard. Bring the after turrets to bear on the enemy." Leitner strode across the bridge, his silk scarf no longer so white. He snapped, "Can't see a damned thing up there! Too much bloody smoke!" He shaded his eyes to look for the destroyer. If there were any survivors, they were left far astern, forgotten. Heckler asked, "Can I signal Lübeck to take station again?" "No, let Rau have his fun. He can take the lead." Flash, 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 flash. The blink of gunfire partly masked by a mist along the horizon. It looked like copper-coloured smoke, the screeching hiss of a falling salvo, and then the tall waterspouts which betrayed the fall of the enemy's shells. Heckler stared at the Lübeck, which was almost turned on, her turrets trained hard round to bear on the enemy, where his own ship should be. The bridge quivered again, and Heckler could feel the din of gunfire probing into his ears like hot wires. "Enemy in sight, sir! Bearing red 45. Heckler lifted his glasses and scanned the distant mist. No longer empty. A dull, blunt silhouette suddenly wreathed in smoke as her guns fired at extreme range. Heckler did not lower his glasses. "Tell the gunnery officer to concentrate on the cruiser." The forward turrets fired instantly, but it was too far away to see the results. Leitner clasped his hands together. "Signal Lübeck to go for the convoy. We'll take care of this upstart." But his voice was drowned by a violent explosion, and as Heckler twisted towards Lübeck, he saw smoke and flame burst from below her bridge and spread upwards and outwards in a fiery scarlet mushroom. The British cruiser had been hit too, but there was no let-up in her gunnery or its accuracy. The Lübeck received another direct hit. She was slowing down, her bow wave dwindling. The speaker intoned, "A hit!" Kroll announced, "Convoy scattering, sir. Cruisers disengaging." The first merchantmen were now in view, ungainly and pathetic as they tried to head away from the oncoming warships. The damaged cruiser was standing off, with two of the destroyers closing around her to take her in tow if need be, or to make a last stand against Prinz Luitpold. "Shift target! Open fire!" The merchantmen had no hope of survival. One by one they were straddled and set ablaze until smoke stretched across the horizon like a dense curtain. "Cease firing!" Heckler said quietly, "In my opinion we should return to Norway, sir." He stood his ground as Leitner stared at him. "Lübeck is down by the head, even under tow." Freber called, "Signal from Lübeck! Unable to make more than 6 knots! Request assistance!" Heckler watched his admiral. That must have cost Rau a lot, he thought. Leitner shrugged. "Signal the senior officer destroyers to escort Lübeck back to base." That evening, as Prinz Luitpold steamed southwest into the Norwegian Sea, she was greeted by a thick mist which cut down the visibility to 2 miles. Every turn of the great triple screws carried them further and further from land, paring away the safety margin should they have to turn and run for home again. Heckler had to admit there was some value in Leitner's confidence. A pack of U-boats had forced home an attack on the big eastbound Russian convoy, and every available British warship was apparently engaged. The flimsy plan might just work, he thought, and Lübeck would reach Norwegian waters where she could carry out her repairs. Heckler could not accept that part. It stuck in his throat like a bitter taste. To leave Lübeck to her fate had been part of the plan, but at no time had Leitner allowed for such a spirited defence of the convoy by the lone British cruiser. Despite the frantic manoeuvring to avoid the torpedo, there had been no damage in the ship apart from some broken crockery in the main galley. There had been plenty of minor casualties. One of them was Erika Franke, who had suffered a severe sprain to her wrist. The medical report had been handed to Heckler with all the other items from the various parts of the ship. It was customary for the doctor to report in person, but he had sent a brief message to say he had too many casualties. Nervousness at meeting him, or a kind of arrogance, Heckler did not know. Yet. Tyle joined him on the bridge, his coat glistening as if it had been raining. The mist was wet and made everything shine in the failing light. Heckler said, "We seem to be clear, Victor." He looked up at the sky, at Leitner's flag curling damply above the ship. "We shall stand to tonight." Tyle looked away. "Do you still intend to run south of Iceland, sir?" Heckler nodded. "Unless we're challenged, yes. At this time of year there's no advantage in taking the northern route through the Denmark Strait. Too much daylight, too many air patrols. If we head between Iceland and the Faroe Islands, it will give us 150 miles on either beam to play with." Tyle grunted. "Do you think we'll get through, sir?" Heckler listened to the steady vibration, felt the confident power of the great engines. She could manage 35 knots if need be. Even a destroyer would find her a difficult one to outpace. It seemed to get darker as they hurried to the southwest. The night an ally, their only friend in this hostile sea. Heckler tried to contain the excitement. It was like heady wine. After the stark pictures of battle and burning ships, the prospect of actually getting into the Atlantic seemed suddenly real and clean. Big supply submarines, milch cows, were to be employed as tankers for the Prince. Daring it certainly was. Practical? Nobody knew, as it had never been done before. Heckler said suddenly, "I was sorry to hear about your wife." Tyle stared at him, and then at the nearest of the watchkeepers. He lowered his voice. "The Admiral?" "He had to tell me, Victor. I would have been informed anyway if Leitner was not aboard." "What's the matter? Did you think I'd see you as a lesser man?"
Tyle felt the color draining from his face. "It makes no difference to my ability. None whatever. And anyone—"
Heckler slid from his chair and moved his legs to get rid of the stiffness. "I'm going to the sick bay while it's quiet. Take over." He eyed him calmly. "Shake the load off your back, Victor. I just wanted you to know that I am concerned for you, not your bloody ability." Tyle was still staring after him as he clattered down the internal ladder. The new doctor was not at all as Heckler had expected. He was 40 years old, but looked much older. He had a heavy, studious face with gold-rimmed glasses. He made to stand, but Heckler closed the door of the sickbay and sat down. Then he pulled out his pipe and said, "Is this all right?" Karl-Heinz Stroheim watched him warily. He said, "I have dealt with all the casualties, Captain." Heckler lit his pipe. A good feeling, almost sensuous after being deprived on the bridge. "I thought we should meet, so—" He blew out some smoke. "So Mohammed and the mountain, you see? I'm honored." "You'll find this a different appointment from your last. The barracks at Wilhelmshaven, right?" The man nodded. "Before that, well, you know about it too. You were in trouble." A flash of anger came and went in Stroheim's brown eyes. "I was too valuable to be thrown out. They put me in uniform instead." "No disgrace in that. Abortions, wasn't it?" Stroheim's jaw dropped. "How did you know?" "I didn't. I guessed. And I shall put down your lack of respect to the suddenness of your appointment, right?" I am sorry, Captain. I went through a lot. One day they will accept my views. I have always believed—" He hesitated, as if he expected Heckler to stop or reprimand him. "A woman must have the right to choose. There should be a better reason for having a child than producing soldiers and more mothers for Germany." Heckler stood up. "We'll talk again." He made to leave and almost collided with Erika Franke, her left hand bandaged and in a sling. She gave a wry smile. "Next time you change direction, Captain, please let me know. I need both hands for flying, you know." "I was sorry to hear of your injury." She laughed. It was the first time he had seen her really laugh. He said, "Can I see you to your quarters?" "So correct, so proper, Captain.
"I shall walk with you. I find the ladders a bit difficult at the moment." They reached the upper deck. She said, "I would like to visit the bridge again. I hate being shut away down here. I feel trapped." "Any time." He watched her, the way she moved her head, the color of her eyes. He had hoped to see her. The doctor had been an excuse. A messenger skidded to a halt and saluted. "There's a message from the bridge, Captain." Heckler strode to a handset which was clipped to the grey steel and cranked the handle. He heard Tile's voice. "The Admiral had a signal, sir. Lübeck was sunk." Heckler replaced the handset very slowly. She watched him, her eyes concerned. "May I ask, Captain?" "Lübeck's gone." "You didn't want to leave her, did you? I was told. Everyone knew. They are very fond of their young captain, you know." "There are no secrets in a ship, no matter what they say. Yes, I wanted to stay with her. Now she's gone." He thought of the burning convoy. They had had their revenge. He touched the girl's sound arm. "Later, then." He opened the heavy door and stepped out into the damp air. Lübeck had been sacrificed. He quickened his pace to the first ladder, oblivious of the watchful gun crews. It must not have been in vain. The South African naval base of Simonstown was packed to capacity with warships of every class and size. The largest cruiser was HMS Wiltshire, a big 10,000-ton vessel typical of a class which had been constructed in accordance with the Washington Treaty in the late 20s. It was Sunday, and apart from the duty watch and men under punishment, Wiltshire was deserted. In his day cabin, Captain James Cook Hrose, Distinguished Service Order, Royal Navy, sat beneath a deckhead fan and regarded his pink gin, while he wondered if it was prudent to take another. He was in his late 40s, but service life had been hard on him. He looked older, much older, and what was worse, he felt it. The door opened and the ship's commander entered quietly. Hrose gestured heavily to the sideboard. "Have a pink Plymouth, Toby. Do you good." The commander looked at the signals on the table and said, "It's all true then, sir?" "Yes, it's true." Hros's eyes were distant. "The Jerrys have put one of their big cruisers to sea. They think it might be Prinz Luitpold." His eyes hardened into focus. "I hope to God it is." The commander sipped his gin. "She won't get down here, not at this stage of the war." When Hrose remained silent, he added, "I mean, it's just not on, sir." Hrose sighed. The commander, Toby Godson, was a well-meaning fool. He ran a smart ship, and that was enough. Until the signal had arrived, anyway. Hrose recalled his excitement, although he would rather die than display it. As from today, he was promoted acting commodore, to take upon himself the command of a small squadron, to take all necessary steps to seek out and engage the German raider, should she manage to penetrate the defences and come to the South Atlantic. It was unlikely, as Godson had said, but it had given him a well-needed boost. Acting commodore, a temporary appointment at the best of times, but it was his chance. The commander asked carefully, "I'd forgotten, sir. You crossed swords with Prinz Luitpold before, North Cape, wasn't it?" "I don't forget. They say that Rear Admiral Leitner's in command." Hrose glowered. "I don't give a bloody damn about him. Her captain's the man. Heckler. He was in command at North Cape when—" The commander said, "She's a miniature battle cruiser, sir. Makes our armor plate look like cardboard." Hrose ignored him. "Came out of the snow like a cliff. It was gun for gun." He looked around the pleasant cabin, remembering it as it had been. This place was riddled like a bloody pepper pot. She made off anyway, sir. Aye, she did that just as well. It was a right cock-up, I can tell you. I hope it is Heckler in command. I'll get him this time." He gave a rueful grin. "Now he's like I was at North Cape." "How so, sir?" Hrose laughed out loud. "He's got his bloody admiral breathing down his neck. That's why." The Prinz Luitpold had made it. This great ship had passed through the 300-mile gap without opposition. Not a ship, not even a distant aircraft had been sighted. Leitner stared unwinking at the chart and said, "We did it, as planned." He looked at the darkened figures around him. 2 days since the convoy, and now we are Here!" He slapped the chart with unusual fervor. "The Atlantic, gentlemen! They said it could not be done!" Some of the men were shaking hands and grinning at each other. Only Gudegast remained unmoved and grim-faced. He said, "I should like to alter course in 15 minutes, sir." Heckler nodded. "I shall come up." A seaman called. "From the bridge, sir." He held out the telephone. It was Frober, who was in charge of the watch. "Radar has reported a faint echo at Red 10, sir, about 5 miles. That was close. Too close. Heckler said, "Alter course to intercept." Leitner muttered, "Something small, eh? God damn them, it might have been a submarine's conning tower. At 5 miles, anything might happen." Frober spoke again, relieved. "We've identified it, sir. It's a boat." Heckler hurried from the conning tower, not caring if Leitner was in agreement or not. On the main bridge it was quite cold, and the clouds had thickened considerably. He raised his glasses and felt the deck tilt very slightly as the helm went over. Then he saw it and felt his taut muscles relax. There would be no attack from this lonely boat. Tyle said, "A boat full of corpses." "Slow ahead, all engines." Tyle was peering at him with disbelief. "You're not going to stop!" Heckler said, "Bosun's mate, call away the accident boat." The boat would automatically have an experienced petty officer in charge. He glanced at young Jaeger. "You go. Keep your wits about you." Tyle said between his teeth, "In the name of God, sir, we're a sitting target." Heckler said quietly, "Keep your voice down, Victor." Soon the motorboat was speeding across the swell, Jaeger looking astern at the cruiser and probably wondering what would happen if there was an attack. Heckler knew Leitner was beside him, could smell his cologne. But he kept his eyes on the little drama as the motorboat hooked on and Jaeger with a petty officer scrambled over the gunwale. A signalman lowered his glasses. "Two alive, sir." "Call the sick bay." More feet on the ladder, and he heard her thank a seaman for helping her through the gate. She was wearing her black leather jacket again, her hair ruffling in the breeze. Tyle moved aside so that she could stand between Heckler and the Admiral. She asked, "Just two?" Heckler nodded. She was probably thinking of its futility. When he glanced at her, he saw moisture in her eyes, or were they tears? Leitner remarked, "Flotsam of war, my dear." She said huskily, She tried again. "I knew somebody who died at sea." Heckler glanced down at her. She looked sick. The motion was getting worse as the prince rose and dipped like a huge juggernaut. "Sit in the chair. Take some deep breaths." Then, so that the others should not hear, he added quietly, "Stay in the air, little bird. The ocean can be a dirty place." He glanced across her head. "Take over. I'm going to the sick bay." Someone yelled, "Boat's hooked on, sir." The motorboat rose swiftly on its falls, and Frober asked, "The lifeboat, Captain. Shall I have a shot put into it?" "No. They have found their harbor. Leave them alone." A great tremor ran through the deck, and he felt the men sighing with relief as the great screws began to beat out their track of white froth again. Leitner called sharply, "Find out what you can, eh?" The doctor was wiping his hands on a towel, and Heckler saw that both blanket-wrapped survivors were lying in bunks inside the office and away from the injured sailors. One, a young officer with 2 tarnished stripes on his sleeve, was conscious, but only just. Hollow-eyed and filthy, he was staring at the white deckhead with shock and disbelief. The other man was much older, with a white beard. Perhaps he had already seen and done too much when his ship had been blasted from under him. The doctor said, "I've given them something, Captain. They'll sleep. I shall get them some hot soup later on." He nodded to the pathetic belongings on the glass table. "They were aboard the Radna Star, a freighter." The doctor took off his glasses and polished them, as he had done at their first meeting. He said, "So this is the Atlantic, the killing ground they warned me about." Heckler looked at him. "Don't be clever with me, Doctor. Report when they recover enough to speak." He waited outside, breathing hard, angry with the doctor, more so with himself for dropping the guard he had built up so carefully. When he reached the bridge, he was greeted in silence. With a start, he realized she was still sitting in the tall chair, wrapped about with somebody's heavy watch-coat. She did not say anything, and he was grateful. He stared down with surprise as she placed her hand on his wrist. She did not move it or grip with it. It lay there, separate, as if to listen. She said quietly, "I am here, Captain. I shared it with you. I saw it through your eyes." Heckler looked at her neat hand and wanted to seize it, press it against himself. She had understood, as if he had shouted aloud. He said, "I would like to talk." He felt her hand move away very slightly. "Later. Afterwards." She said, "Afterwards may not be ours, Captain." She slid from the chair and handed the coat to a seaman with a quick smile. Then she melted into the shadows, and he heard one of his men assisting her on the ladder. She would probably laugh in his face if he even laid a hand on her. What about the man who had been lost at sea? She had nearly said something else. My lover, perhaps? Back in the cabin, he thought, afterwards may not be ours. Her words seemed to linger in his mind. His head lolled, and he was instantly asleep. The Prinz Luitpold's senior medical officer looked up from his book and saw the girl standing in the open door. "Can't you sleep either?" She walked to a chair and glanced at the two motionless survivors swaying gently in their white cots. "My wrist, it's bothering me." He took her hand and reached out for some scissors. "You're new aboard the ship." "I am. Lost among strangers." She said, "Call me Erica, if you like." He cut the last of the bandage. "I do like." Her skin felt hot, feverish. He remembered all those other women. The scandal which had almost got him into prison, a ruined man. But the women who came to him in trouble were people of influence. Like the captain's wife, for instance. Well-bred from an old family, she was always in the centre of society, that jungle which was safe only for the privileged few. He wondered if the captain really knew what she was like. One of his colleagues had once described her as a thoroughly delectable whore. He said, "It is a bit stiff, Erica. I have to fly in a day or so." "It will be all right by then." "I wanted to talk. I knew you would still be awake. It's not like a ship down here." "I suppose not. I shall attempt to keep it that way." "I was with the captain when these survivors were brought aboard." He said nothing and waited, so that was it. She said, "He is different from what I expected." "An enigma, perhaps?" "He seems to care so much about people. How can he do his work?" Stroheim spread his hands. "Perhaps it is tearing him apart. I do not know him that well, yet." "But you know his wife, don't you?" "How do you hear these things?" "A friend told me." "She is very beautiful." "I met her." "Well, you know what she's like." "Are they still married or anything?" "Anything would be closer, I believe." She opened and closed her left hand, her face expressionless as she tested the pain, the discomfort. "Stay in the air, little bird." "I'll say good night, then." She looked at the two sleeping figures. Flotsam, Leitner had called them. Or good morning now, I believe. He watched her leave and then reopened his book. Every so often, even in the midst of danger and death, there was one small light. Like a flower in a forest. A lone star. "Stop engines!" Acting Commodore James Cook Hrose sat stiff-backed in his bridge chair and surveyed what was left of the convoy. A battlefield. A junk yard. The commander stood beside him as the way went off the ship, and the endless litter of wreckage, bodies, and pieces of men parted across the Wiltshire's high stem. Half a mile astern, her signal lamp flashing like a diamond eye, the New Zealand light cruiser Pallas followed reluctantly amongst the remains. The convoy had scattered at the last moment when the first salvos must have come crashing down. Hammers of hell, Hrose thought bitterly. "Stand by to lower boats." Hrose trained his binoculars across the sea, hating the stench of escaping fuel oil and burned paintwork. A few figures floated or splashed amongst the filth, their bodies shining and pitiful in the oil. There were more corpses than living, but it was worth a try. Hrose said savagely, "Whole convoy wiped out except for these pathetic remnants." He pounded the arm of his chair with his fist. All they needed was another day. The escort group was on the way from Gib, and 3 destroyers from Bermuda, and us. The Admiralty had confirmed that the raider was Prinz Luitpold, and fresh details came in every hour. If Wiltshire had been on the spot, she might have scored a lucky hit, enough to cripple the bastard, or at least slow him down. Now the German could be anywhere. He thought of the signals and the information from the lone freighter Dunedin Pioneer, which had been left untouched. Somebody aboard that poor ship, a spectator to the total destruction of the one which had been towing her, had kept his head, had reported seeing the enemy's faint silhouette as she headed away at full speed to the southwest. The commander had asked, "Give chase, sir?" The raider had steamed away without sinking the Dunedin Pioneer. There had to be a reason. Now, as he watched the oil-streaked boats picking their way amongst the human remains, he went over it again for the 100th time. Give chase? To where? To the coastline of Brazil, or back along the same course? According to the latest intelligence, there were 17 major convoys at sea, well escorted for the most part, but to resist U-boat and bombing attacks, not a bloody great cruiser like Prinz Luitpold. Hrose still could not fathom how it had happened. The RAF recce boys had reported that after the battle near Bear Island, Prinz Luitpold had been seen and photographed back at her lair in Bordeaux. It did not make any sense. Give chase? I don't think so, Toby. He had a reason for letting the Dunedin Pioneer stay afloat. He wanted her to see him steam away to report his course. It felt easier now that he had decided. No. I reckon he changed direction as soon as he was clear of all this. Get the convoy lists and we'll study the chart. Outguess the bastard. It's up to us. As I see it, Toby, we'll get precious little advice from their lordships just now. Signal a call to the boats and we'll get underway. That destroyer can stand by the survivors until the escort group turns up. He looked down from the bridge and saw the first survivors being led away, wrapped in oil-sodden blankets. There did not seem to be many of them, he thought. "Resume course. Cruising speed, Toby." He settled back in the chair. "Send for a brandy. I need to think about this one." Astern, the listless ships and the great span of oil and fragments seemed to fill the horizon. For Hrose, the war had suddenly become a personal one. Heckler wriggled his shoulders deeper into his watch-coat and felt the damp air exploring his bones. It was afternoon, and the sky was almost hidden by dark-bellied clouds. He saw the rear admiral appear around Turret Anton, his face flushed and youthful in the distance. He was walking in step with Oberleutnant Bauer, the signals and communications officer. They could be brothers, he thought. Bauer was also the political officer and had been having a lot of private conversations with Leitner. What did they discuss? The prince's captain, probably. It was a strange relationship, Heckler thought. Leitner had been as good as his word for the most part, and had let him handle the ship in his own way. As they had steered southwest away from the broken convoy, Leitner had only once questioned his judgment. Heckler had answered, "The British will look for clues. By heading southwest in view of that ship which was under tow, they will assume it was a ruse, and expect us to alter course immediately to throw them off the scent. I think I would." Leitner had considered it, his eyes opaque, giving nothing away. "But if not, Dieter, suppose the British Admiral thinks as you do." Then he had nodded and had given his broad grin. "Of course, that other convoy. They will think we are after it." OKM Operations Division had signaled more information about a vast troop convoy, which was scheduled to head around the Cape of Good Hope en route for England. It was one of the biggest of its kind, too large to turn back, too vital to stop. So the Prinz Luitpold had carried on as before. Heckler watched the two wind-swept figures of Bauer and Leitner until they vanished beneath the bridge. He thought of Leitner's broadcast that morning to the ship's company. Rousing, passionate, compelling. It was all those things, if you did not know the man. Heckler had watched him as he had stood with the handset close to his lips in the armoured Admiral's bridge. The flag lieutenant and Bauer had also been present, while Leitner's clipped tones had penetrated the ship above and below decks. He had spoken of Lübeck's loss at some length. Her sacrifice. "We must not fail her, can never forget they fought for us to give us the freedom to break out into the Atlantic. For us and our beloved fatherland." But there had been the flash of anger over Leitner's mysterious boxes. Heckler had requested permission to move them deeper in the hull, so that their space could be used to store additional short-range ammunition. Leitner had snapped, "They belong to me. I will not be questioned. I am entrusted to this mission to carry it out in my way. If we are crippled or sunk in battle, my boxes will go to the bottom too." So they were that valuable, Heckler thought. He heard Tile's footsteps on the gratings and shifted round to look at him. "All well, Victor?" Things were still strained between them, although Tile had shown his old pride and excitement when the enemy convoy had been destroyed. Heckler had found no satisfaction from it. It had been slaughter, the careering merchantmen and their escorts falling to their massive bombardment like targets in a fairground. He had told himself that they would have done the same to Prinz Luitpold, would have cheered like his own men if they had been left to burn and drown. It was their war, what they had trained for, what they must do. Tile shrugged and stared moodily at the grey ocean, the lift and dip of the raked bows. "Yes, sir. I have just questioned the prisoner, the officer named Ames. The other one is raving. I can't imagine how he ever got to sea." Heckler eyed him thoughtfully. The old sailor should have been ashore with his grandchildren, not fighting for his life in an open boat. They had been adrift for 5 weeks. How could the human body stand it? But it was pointless to say as much to Tile. Tile said abruptly, "The Englishman knows nothing, just that the torpedoes hit his ship in the forward hold. She sank in minutes, apparently." Heckler glanced at his watch. The rendezvous with the supply U-boat was in 20 minutes' time. There was a coughing roar from amidships, and Heckler stirred uneasily in his chair. He wanted to walk aft and watch the brightly painted Arado as it was tested on the catapult. Leitner had told him that it would be launched without further delay. The camera team would be down there too, waiting to record their audacity as they flew off their new aircraft, indifferent to the enemy and what they could do. Heckler had seen the girl when he had left the bridge to visit the various action stations while the ship had steamed away from the last fall of shot. Now she was down there with the aircraft handling party, ready to fly off, so that some lunatic's desire for patriotic realism could be filmed. Tile said dourly, "I think it is madness to put that plane in the air. Suppose—" Leitner strode onto the bridge, the familiar silk scarf flapping in the keen air. He smiled at the bridge party and then returned Heckler's salute. "See, the sky is brightening. It will do our people at home a lot of good to see these films." Later, Heckler walked from his chair and leaned over the screen, the damp wind pressing into his face. He saw the camera team down aft, some sailors freshly changed into their best uniforms, outwardly chatting to their admiral. Heckler looked at the vibrating Arado on the catapult, trained outboard ready to be fired off. He saw the girl's helmeted head lowered to speak with one of the deck crew before she closed the cockpit cover and waved a gloved hand. He felt his stomach contract and was stunned by the sudden concern. There was nothing that they could do or share. What was the matter with him? He tensed as the shining Arado roared from the catapult and without hesitation climbed up and away from the slow-moving cruiser. Leitner returned to the bridge, his eyes squinting as he watched the little plane weaving and circling over the water. He said, "I hope she flies nearer than that. It's a camera down aft, not a bloody gun sight." Heckler lifted his binoculars and watched the weak sunlight lance through the clouds to pick out the plane's thin silhouette. 5 minutes, sir." Guragast's voice made him put his thoughts together. Leitner remarked, "Now we shall see, eh?" It was more like a shoal of fish than a surfacing submarine. When the hull eventually appeared some half-mile distant, it rose with a kind of tired majesty. Even as they watched, men were swarming from her squat conning tower, while from her casing, untidy-looking derricks and hoses were already rising from hidden compartments. The tannoy bleared below the bridge, and men ran to the prepared tackles and winches, ready to haul the fuel lines to the bunkers. Heckler saw the men waving to each other across the water. It must be a heartening sight to see such a big warship at large in enemy waters, he thought. Heckler watched the oily hoses jerking busily as the fuel was pumped across the gap of heaving water. What a strange war it was becoming. He glanced down at the deck below as an armed seaman walked past beside the captured English officer. Tile said, "I think it unwise to let him walk about like that." Heckler smiled. He is hardly a threat, Victor. He looked up to seek out the Arado, but the sky seemed empty. She would be feeling free right now, he thought. Unlike the sad-faced prisoner who walked alone despite all the seamen around him. But the young Englishman who had been the radio officer, but now wore another man's uniform jacket, was anything but despairing. On his way to the upper deck, he had heard the one sound which was so familiar that it pulled at his reserve like claws. The urgent stammer of Morse and waves of hissing static. The radio room, with at least 3 headphoned operators at their bench, was like a laboratory compared with anything he had been used to. But the idea had formed in his mind even as they had passed the open door. It was his one chance. His life would be forfeit, but he found it surprisingly easy to accept that. He had died back there in the open boat with his gaunt, eyeless companions. When the time was right, it would take just one signal to bring the Navy down on this bloody German like a force of avenging angels. Erika Franke adjusted the clips of her safety harness and peered to starboard as she eased the Arado into a shallow dive. She watched the ship in the distance, her outline strangely broken and unreal in its striped dazzle paint. Beyond her was the austere shape of the great supply submarine. She saw the perspex screen mist over very slightly and adjusted her compass accordingly. The looming clouds said rain. She bit her lip. If the visibility fell away, she must return to the ship immediately. She touched the microphone across her mouth. Rain soon. She heard the observer of Westphal acknowledge her comment with a grunt. A thick-set, bovine man, he obviously resented being in the hands of a woman. She ignored him. It was nothing new in her life. The Arado swayed jerkily, and she quickly increased throttle until the blurred propeller settled again into a misty circle. The plane was unarmed, or at least it carried no ammunition. Just as well, she thought. That was one kind of flying she had not tried. She thought of the 2 survivors who had been brought to the ship by the young officer, Jaeger. He was a nice young man, she thought, and she had seen him looking at her when she had joined the others in the wardroom for meals. When she glanced down at the endless heaving water, she recalled another face with sharper clarity. Klaus had loved her, and she him. He had been married, but the war had brought them together in Italy. She had learned of his death through a friend. His ship had been torpedoed, lost with all hands. It was over. She came back with a start as Westphal's surly voice intruded into her memories. "Time to turn! Visibility's down!" They would fly back now, she thought, and the camera crew would film her landing near the ship, and again as she stepped aboard to be greeted by Andreas Leitner. She moved the controls sharply, so that the plane tilted over to port. She could feel the pull of her harness, the pain in her breast as the Arado went over even further, until it appeared as if the wingtip was cutting the water like a fin. The changing light, the endless procession of unbroken waves. Or was it a shadow? Dead ahead. She eased the throttle with great care. "Do you see it?" "What? Where?" She found that she could watch a submarine quite calmly, for that was what it was, another submarine. It looked dark, blue-grey like a shark, with a lot of froth streaming from aft, and a faint plume of vapour above the conning tower. Westphal snapped, "Enemy boat! Charging batteries and using her schnorkel!" He reached forward to prod her shoulder. "Back to the ship! Fast!" The girl eased the controls over to port. Westphal had seen what he had expected to see, but had missed something vital. The submarine was trimmed too high. Most of them would be almost at full periscope depth to charge batteries. The submarine must be damaged, unable to dive. Thoughts raced through her mind, and in her imagination she could hear Heckler's voice, then see the cruiser and the supply submarine lying somewhere back there, totally unaware of this unexpected threat. Damaged she might be, but her commander would not hesitate when Prinz Luitpold's silhouette swam into his crosswires. Erika Franke had learned quite a lot about the Navy. She knew that a submarine on the surface nearby could interfere with radar accuracy, and that was exactly what was happening right now. She thrust the controls forward and tilted the Arado into a steep dive. Westphal shouted wildly, "What the hell are you doing? They'll see us!" Sure enough, there were tiny ant-like figures on the submarine's deck. She shouted, "By the time we made contact with the ship, it would be all over!" Then she winced as several balls of livid green tracer floated past the port wing, and the plane danced wildly to shell bursts. The clouds enfolded the aircraft, and she peered at the compass, her brain working coolly but urgently as she pictured the other vessels, the enemy submarine's bearing and line of approach. She was probably American, one of their big ocean-going boats. The plane jerked, and she heard metal rip past her body. But the engine was behaving well. It was time to turn back. By now the Prinz Luitpold must have heard the shooting. There was still time. She twisted round in her seat to yell at Westphal, but choked on a scream as she saw his bared teeth, his fists bunched in agony at the moment of impact. His goggles were completely filled with blood, like a creature from a nightmare. The plane rocked again, and she almost lost control as more bursts exploded nearby. She felt as if all the breath had been punched from her body, and when she looked down she saw a tendril of blood seeping through the flying suit and over her belt. Then the pain hit her like a hot iron, and she heard herself whimpering and calling while she tried to find the compass and bring the plane onto the right bearing. Nor could she call up the ship, dared not. The submarine would know instantly what he probably only suspected.
"Oh, dear God!"
The words were torn from her.
"Help me!"
But the engine's roar drowned her cries, and every vibration made her swoon in agony. She thrust one hand against her side as blood ran over her thigh and down into her flying boot. There was the ship, the supply submarine almost alongside. The lines between the two vessels were being cast off, and a great frothing wash was surging from beneath Prinz Luitpold's bows as she increased to maximum speed. The girl fought to control the spin to bring the aircraft's nose up and level off. All she could think of was that she had warned him. She would never know if she was in time. When a lookout yelled, "Gunfire to the northwest!" Heckler moved like lightning to the compass platform. "Discontinue fueling." He waved his arm. "Cast off! Take in those wires!" Leitner was beside him, peering at him wildly. "What the hell's going on?" "Gunfire means an enemy, sir." He swung round as a lookout yelled, "Aircraft, red for 5, angle of sight 40. Stand by, secondary armament." He levelled his glasses and found the Arado almost immediately. It was rolling from side to side, but apparently intact. He felt his heart throbbing as he followed every painful movement. He lowered his glasses and saw the remaining wire dragging the heavy submarine dangerously close alongside. "Cut that line! Now!" He turned back again, but the plane had plunged into some low clouds. The gunnery intercom intoned, "Submarine on the surface, bearing red 20, range 4000. Heckler called, "Full ahead, all engines." If that wire refused to part, they would take the milch cow with them. "Aircraft in sight again, sir. Closing. Shift bearing to red 60. Lines parted, sir." "Open fire." The 3 twin turrets along the port side opened up instantly. Tyle called, "Supply boats diving, sir." Heckler tore his eyes from the Arado as it reeled over the ship and then appeared to level off on an invisible wire. Not before he had seen the bright, star-like holes in the paintwork, some of which appeared to cross the cockpit itself. She had drawn enemy fire. There was no other possible reason but to warn the ship. "Torpedoes running to port!" Tyle jumped to the voice pipe, but Heckler snapped, "As she goes!" He looked quickly at the supply boat. Her bows were already under water, her squat conning tower deserted as she prepared to run deep and head away. The explosion was like one great thunderclap, which rendered men blind and deaf in a few seconds. The torpedoes must have hit the big submarine just as she made to lift her tail and dive. There could be nothing left. "Target is diving, sir!" Diving or sinking, it made no difference now. That last salvo would put her out of the fight. Leitner wiped his binoculars and glared through the fading smoke. "Another minute and we'd have shared the same end, Dieter." Heckler steadied his glasses as the Arado's bright paintwork gleamed through the smoke. It was settled on the water and rocking like a wild thing in the powerful rollers. He said, "Stop engines! Slip the boat!" He raised his glasses once more. Thought held at bay while he searched for the aircraft, made himself ready for what he might find. He flinched as he saw the horrific face in the rear of the cockpit, eyes of blood, hands in raised fists behind the slumped figure at the controls. He gripped the binoculars harder as the motorboat's bowman clambered onto one of the plane's floats and hauled himself onto the fuselage. He wrenched open the cockpit and faltered. It must be 100 times worse close to, Heckler thought despairingly. Then he saw the man turn and signal. 1 dead. She was alive. Alive. Bells jangled softly, and the ship gathered way again. Heckler hesitated at the top of the ladder to watch as the Arado was swung over the guardrails on its special derrick. The doctor and his assistant were there, and some men with stretchers. She was alive. Because of what she had done, they had all survived. He glanced at the Admiral's stiff shoulders. He had made an enemy there, but it no longer mattered. He nodded to Tyle and then hurried down the ladder. This world could wait. The Prinz Luitpold's spacious wardroom was almost deserted. It was halfway through the first watch. A few officers sat in deep armchairs, discussing the explosion which had destroyed the supply submarine and everyone aboard. Victor Tyle, as the senior officer in the mess, stood with his back to the bar, a glass of lemon juice in his hand. His immediate subordinate, Korvettenkapitän Werner Fröber, asked, "Do you think it went well today?" Tyle eyed him warily. He replied, "We saved the new plane anyway. Pity about the observer." Fröber grimaced. "And the woman caught a splinter, I'm told." "Could have been much worse." Fröber watched him dubiously. "I just hope they know what they're doing." "Who?" "I don't know. The staff, the high command, everybody who doesn't have to pick up the bloody pieces." Two of the very junior officers hovered closer, and one said, "At home, our people will know about us, and of Lübeck's great sacrifice." Tyle smiled. "Of course. We are honored to serve in this way." A figure moved heavily into the light. It was the doctor, jacket unbuttoned, his tie crooked. To Tyle he said, "There are 10 casualties below, all doing well." The same young officer exclaimed, "They are lucky to be free of standing their watch." The doctor looked past him. "The Lübeck didn't go down gallantly with guns blazing. By the way, she was scuttled." Tyle exploded. "What are you saying? How dare you tell such lies in this mess?" Stroheim gave him a sad smile. "I was in the WT office. One of the operators broke a finger when he lost his balance as the supply boat blew up. They were monitoring an English-speaking broadcast from Bermuda, it may have been. But that was what they said, and something else to fill your pipe with. The Tommies and their allies are up to the Rhine. Do you hear me? They're up to the Rhine. Don't you see, man? We're on the bloody run." Tyle said sharply, "I must ask you to come with me." The doctor laughed. "Follow you? Of course, sir. Does the truth disturb you that much?" Fröber saw another figure rise from a chair and then slip through a curtained door. It was the flag lieutenant, Bauer. Fröber suppressed a groan. In about 3 minutes the Admiral would know all about this. The doctor moved after Tyle and said mildly, "Don't any of you get sick until I return." Fröber saw the curtain sway across the doctor's back. The poor sod was drunk, too. God, what a mess. Heckler clipped the door behind him and stood inside the Admiral's bridge. "You sent for me, sir?" Leitner glanced up. "If that idiot Tyle cannot keep order in his own wardroom and shut the mouth of any foul defeatist rumor, I will have him removed." He strode about the small bridge, his shadow looming against the grey steel like a spectre. "God damn it! I could order a man shot for such behavior, after all I did for him, the ungrateful bastard!" Heckler said, "He brought the doctor to me, sir." "And I suppose you gave him a pat on the back? He can do no wrong, not one of your officers. Oh, no! Ingratitude, that's what it is! I am betrayed on every side." "I'm sure he acted as he thought right, sir." "Not before half the ship's officers heard what Stroheim said. I should have known, should have overridden your belief in the man, damn him! No wonder his bloody wife was taken away." He paused at that point, his eyes staring as he realized what he had said. "When was that, sir? I must know." Leitner ran his fingers through his hair and replied vaguely, "When we were at Vejle." "What had she done?" "She had been making trouble. Her parents were arrested. Terrorists, I expect." "Is she in prison, sir?" "The Gestapo took her. That's all I know." Heckler thrust his hand into his pocket and gripped his pipe. He felt sick. unable to believe what he had heard. Gestapo. Leitner picked up a telephone and added, "Well, you wanted the truth, Dieter. Sometimes not an easy thing to share, is it? Does Bauer know about it?" "Yes." "Anyone else?" "Only you." Leitner spoke into the telephone and asked for the navigating officer to be awakened and sent to the bridge. He put down the telephone and said, "The war goes on, you see. Within the week we shall carry out an attack which will throw the enemy into utter confusion." "Are you going to tell me about it, sir?" He was surprised that he should sound so level. If he had had a Luger in his hand instead of a pipe, he knew he could have killed him. "When I have decided." "Then I should like to leave, sir." Leitner watched him by the door. "It is up to you whether you tell Tyle about his wife. I will not tolerate interference with my plans because of him or anyone else. Do I make myself clear?" "Perfectly, sir." "Then you are dismissed." He bent over the chart again. Heckler opened the door and groped his way through the darkness, the night air clammy around him. On the forebridge, all was quiet. The men on watch intent on their various sectors, although Heckler guessed that Tyle's confrontation with the doctor would by now be common knowledge. He knew Tyle was waiting for him, could see his dark outline against the pale steel. Tyle said in a fierce whisper, "I have sent him to his quarters, sir." "Good. I will have a word with him in the morning." Tyle persisted angrily.
"He was raving about the truth all the time. I did not believe him anyway. We would have been informed if—"
Heckler did not hear the rest. "What would you do with the truth, I wonder, if I told you here and now that your wife had been taken by the Gestapo? She was probably in some terrible prison. She might even be dead. God, it did not bear thinking about." Tyle finished. "Duty first, I say. The truth can wait." Heckler slipped into the chair and touched his arm. "If you say so, Victor." It was as if Tyle had decided for him. Admiral Leitner had summoned Heckler and his senior officers to a conference. His flag lieutenant laid a new chart on the table. "Now, gentlemen, my information is that the enemy has no idea where we are at present, nor how we are obtaining our own fuel supply." He nodded slowly. "Planning, gentlemen, it far outpaces sentiment and outmoded strategy." He jerked his head at his aide. "Show them." The pointer rested on a mere dot in the Atlantic, just northwest of Ascension Island. Leitner watched their faces as they all craned forward. "The island of St. George. There's a cable and wireless station there which was built just before the outbreak of war." His eyes flashed. "Before we were forced as a nation to defend ourselves against British imperialists and the dictates of Judaism." His aide said nervously, "The wireless station has a powerful transmitter, more so even than those in the Falklands." Heckler asked, "Shall we destroy it, sir?" He felt he had to say something, if only to snap the tension to release his officers from being addressed like unreliable schoolboys. "I spoke of surprise. I intend not to destroy that radio station, but to capture it." They all stared at each other, their incredulity giving way to surprised grins as Leitner explained, "We will fly our landing party ahead. By this method, the enemy will have no chance to warn their patrols and raise the alarm. Down here, in mid-Atlantic, it would be the last thing any sane man would be expecting." He turned his face very sharply to Heckler. "What do you say?" "Capture it and make a false signal." Leitner said, "Yes, when we are ready." He sounded irritated, disappointed perhaps that Heckler had not waited for a full explanation of his plan. Heckler said, "It is a wild chance, and I think it might just work." Leitner said, "We will have another conference tomorrow." He eyed them for a few seconds. "Early. I will not abide laggards in this command." He swung on his heel and left the conning tower. Gudegast exclaimed, "Aircraft! Better them than me." Tyle crossed to Heckler's side. "What do you really think?" "It is a daring plan, Victor. It would mean leaving some volunteers on the island. For them, the war would be over. But we will cross that bridge when we come to it. After the war, they might be heroes." Tyle said fervently, "For Germany, any man would volunteer." "Perhaps." Heckler saw the doctor making for the door and called, "I want to talk to you." The doctor faced him warily. "Sir? Come to the bridge. I should like to ask you something." Kyle watched them leave and ground his teeth, thick as thieves, even after what had happened. It was because of that girl. How could the captain behave so stupidly? The seaman handed Heckler a mug of coffee and another to the doctor, who had joined him, somewhat uneasily in that corner of the bridge. Heckler said, "It will be another clear day tomorrow." "Is that good, sir?" He watched Heckler's strong profile, a face with character and determination. No wonder Erika Franke was so interested. She had not said as much, nor had he asked her directly, but Stroheim knew enough about women to recognize the signs. Heckler sipped the coffee. "It could make things easier for our pilots." He thought of the girl who was convalescing in his sleeping cabin. It might have been Leitner's intention to send her with the others, perhaps with a film camera as her sole protection. She had at least been spared that. He thought, too, of his answer. Another clear day might also bring an unexpected ship or aircraft, detection, and the beginning of a chase. Heckler added abruptly, "You were stupid to speak as you did in the wardroom." Stroheim smiled awkwardly. "Perhaps I was wrong, I'm sorry. But I was angry at the time, incensed. Not that I could do anything. You are non-combatant, but out here you are at risk, like the rest of us." Stroheim made himself look at the ocean and shivered despite his thick coat. "Do you ever have doubts?" Heckler swung round in the chair, his eyes very blue in the strange light. "Doubts? What do you think? My day is full of them. I must question the weather, my resources, the strength and weakness of every man aboard. The ship is like a chain. A weak link can cause disaster." He forced a smile. "Satisfied?" Stroheim grinned. "I'm glad you are in command. I hate the sea, but if I must be here, then so be it." Heckler did not look at him. "You knew my wife. She had come to you for an abortion before, but this time you could not help." Stroheim stared at him. "You knew?" "Guessed. She came to my ship, as you know. I should have realized why she had come. I ought not to have had doubts, eh?" Stroheim said quietly, "You would not be the first one to be deceived, Captain. She would have claimed that the child was yours." Heckler looked away. How could anyone hate the sea? He said, "Thank you for your company." She lay propped up on pillows, her face pale in the bunk light. Heckler heard Stroheim's orderly leave the cabin and, after a slight hesitation, sat down beside the bunk. She watched him and said, "You look tired." "How are you feeling?" She smiled. "The motion is awful. I was nearly sick." She saw his concern and added, "I'm feeling better. Really." He explained how the ship was moving slowly to reach their rendezvous at the right time. She listened in silence, her eyes never leaving his face. "Don't you get tired of it?" She reached out from beneath the sheet and gripped his hand. "It never ends for you, does it?" "You know about the plan to fly off our rados ahead of the ship?" She nodded. "Yes, the Admiral came down to see me." "Can it be done?" "Yes, they could find it. After that—" Heckler pushed it from his thoughts and said, "I want you to be well again, very soon." He studied her face, feature by feature. "My little bird belongs up there, where she is free." He smiled and added, "I wish—" "You wish I was not here, is that it? You are going to fight sooner or later, and you are afraid for me? Do you think I cannot tell what is going on in that mind of yours? I have watched you, listened to what your men say. I gather fragments about you, because it is all I have." She shook her head against the pillow. "Don't you see, you stupid man? I want you to like me. And I look a mess. How could you feel more than you do?" Heckler placed his hand under her head and turned it towards him. He dabbed her face with the corner of the sheet and murmured, "You do not look a mess. You couldn't, even if you wanted to." He touched her face and pushed some hair from her eyes. "And I do like you, more than I should." "What chance—" She touched his mouth with her fingers. "Don't say it, not now. The world is falling down about us. Let us hold on to what we have." She pulled herself closer to him until her hair was against his face.
You came for me. I shall never forget. I wanted you to know." It was more than enough for her, and he could feel the drowsiness coming over her again, as if it was his own. Then he bent over and kissed her lightly on the mouth. A telephone buzzed in the other cabin, and he turned to face the door as the white-coated orderly peered in at him. "The Admiral, sir." Heckler nodded and glanced down again at her face. She was asleep, a small smile still hovering at the corners of her mouth. The navigation officer, Gudegast, stood with his hands on his hips and waited for the two Arado pilots to scribble a few more notes on their pads. The massive steel door purred open on its slide, and Gudegast saw the captain framed against a dull grey sky. "Nearly ready, sir." Heckler glanced at the two pilots who had sprung to attention. At ease. He knew Gudegast would take care of everything. He had done it often enough, but the pilots had to be certain of their orders. Both float planes had been stripped of unnecessary weight and would carry no bombs. Heckler went over it again. Both aircraft would land in a tiny sheltered strip of water, and the landing party would go ashore without delay in rubber dinghies. The planes would be packed like cans of sardines, he thought. He lingered over the officer in charge, Oberleutnant Bauer. An obvious choice, as he was a communications specialist. 8 men in all, excluding the pilots. The intelligence reports were definite about the radio station. There were only 3 men on that lonely pinnacle of rock. Gudegast had said, "What a way to fight a war. The poor bastards might never be told if it's over, or who's won." Tyle had snapped at him, "The war will end for them if they try to sabotage the station." Poor Tyle. He was looking more strained, with deep lines around his mouth. Heckler glanced at the bulkhead clock. 5 minutes. He nodded to the pilots. "Good luck." He made his way to the forebridge and noted the lookouts and gun crews huddled together at their defense stations. Tyle joined him on the gratings, his fingers busily adjusting his powerful binoculars. Heckler glanced at him. "After we find the convoy, Victor, we can turn for home. Fight our way right through the British fleet, if need be." A phone buzzed, and the seaman who picked it up yelled, "Ready, sir!" Heckler could imagine Leitner peering down from his armored nest, but he did not turn to look. "Go!" The plane roared along the short catapult, dived clumsily towards the water, rallied, and then climbed away from the slow-moving ship. Voices muttered by the starboard ladder, and Jaeger said, "Visitor, sir." Heckler glanced across in time to see Tyle's frowning disapproval and the signalman's quick grin. She crossed the bridge very carefully, her hair rippling over her coat collar, while she rested on a stanchion for support. Heckler took her hand and guided her to the chair. He asked, "How are you?" He noticed the way she was holding her side, all those ladders, and she was still weak from losing so much blood. She settled down on the chair and tucked her chin into a scarf. The doctor said it was safe. She watched the second Arado as it roared away from the side. "I feel better already." Heckler looked at her and found he was able to shelve his immediate problems, the next fueling rendezvous, the convoy, the cost in ships and men. He offered, "You look fine. You've got your color back." She looked at him, and for a few moments it was like a bond, a physical embrace, although neither of them had moved. A seaman called, "From WT office, sir. They are monitoring a broadcast and request instructions." Heckler nodded. "You go down, Victor. It may be nothing, but we need all the news we can get." 5 minutes later, Jaeger said, "WT office, sir." He held out the telephone. "Captain?" It was Tyle. "It was just some Brazilian radio station, sir." He sounded petulant, as if he thought a junior officer could have been sent to deal with it. "Never mind, Victor. Check it through. You might glean something, eh?" He put the telephone in Jaeger's hand. "Ask the navigating officer to come here." He smiled, glad of something to distract him, as he saw Gudegast already present, stripping off the canvas cover from the ready-used chart table. "What do you think?" "They should be there now, sir." Heckler nodded. The WT office would have picked up any alarm call from the island if the mission had gone rotten on them. There was always a chance, of course, that the two pilots had lost their way. He saw Gudegast's expression and knew it was less than likely. "Take over. Full speed. Warn radar and tell the gunnery officer to muster his landing party." Tyle watched the stooped shoulders of the radio operators and listened to the endless murmur of Morse and static over the speakers. The junior officer in charge stared at him anxiously and said, "I am not certain, sir. My superior has left no instructions." Tyle glared. "I'll deal with it." He gripped the handle of Lieutenant Bauer's private office and then rattled it angrily. "It's locked, sir." "I can see that, you dolt. Give me the key." The young one-striper wrenched open a desk and handed it to him. He slammed the door behind him and slumped down in Bauer's chair. There was a framed photograph of a young naval officer on the desk. Tyle picked it up and grunted. It was Bauer himself, typical of the man. There was another key on the tag, a much smaller one. He pushed the key into a steel drawer and held his breath as it clicked open. His hand faltered on a pale pink folder, with the eagle crest and stamp of Naval Intelligence emblazoned on the cover. He flicked it open and felt his heart stop. His own name was at the top. Serial number, rank, date of commission, everything. His fingers felt numb, unable to turn the page. There was a freshly typed signal, flimsy, under the first page. His eyes blurred as he scanned the bottom, first where Leitner's signature had been countersigned by Bauer. The name at the top was Britta's. His wife. Apart from a file reference, there was little else except for the line which stood out like fire. No further action by Naval Intelligence. Subject arrested by Gestapo. Tyle did not remember locking the desk drawer, or even groping his way from the office. He staggered to the upper deck and clung to the safety rail by a watertight door for several minutes. Britta arrested. It could not be. For an instant he was tempted to rush back there and read the file again. But it was true. It had to be. Britta arrested? He wanted to scream it out aloud. They all knew, must have done. Leitner and that crawling Bauer. Heckler would know too, had probably been told weeks ago. He allowed his mind to rest on the Gestapo. He had always avoided contact with them, like most people. Secrecy had not always worked, and he had ignored that too. But he had heard things. Torture. Brutality for the sake of it. Gestapo. It was not just a word anymore. It was death. The ship began to shake and quiver around him, and he knew they were increasing speed towards the tiny islet. What should he do, or say? Britta was dead, or was she even now screaming out her pleas to her torturers? "No!" His one cry was torn from him, but rebounded against the iron plate as if it too was trapped and in agony. Oberleutnant Hans Bauer strode down the steep, rocky slope and stared at the two floatplanes as they lifted and swayed in the swell. They were safe enough, moored with their small anchors and each with its pilot still aboard in case the sea should get up. He had enjoyed every moment of it. The culmination of surprise and excitement when the two rubber dinghies had been paddled furiously ashore and his men rounded up their prisoners. There had been 2 extra people at the radio station, mechanics who had been left here for some maintenance work. He shaded his eyes to watch the cruiser's shortened silhouette as she headed towards the small islet, only her bow wave revealing the speed she was making through the water. He turned and surveyed the desolated station. A long, curved, corrugated building which the British called a Nissen hut, and 2 radio masts. Closer to the building lay a corpse, covered by a sheet which was pinned down by heavy rocks. One of the visiting mechanics. He had seen the landing party and had turned, blundering through his astonished companions, and run towards the building. Bauer remembered his own feeling as the heavy Luger had leaped in his grip, the man spinning round, his eyes wide with horror as he had rolled down the slope, kicking and choking. The second bullet had finished all movement. After that, the others had crowded together, shocked and frightened, seeing only the levelled guns, the sprawled body of the dead man. Bauer had told them to obey each order without hesitation, and after the building had been thoroughly searched, the radio transmitter checked for demolition charges. They had been locked in a storeroom and left under guard. He saw his own petty officer, a grim-faced man called Maleg, coming down the slope, 2 grenades bouncing on his hip. He was not one of Bauer's choice for the raid. He thought of Tyle, who had detailed the man for the operation. Bauer was suddenly grateful he had never cultivated Tyle as anything more than a superior officer. How could such a man become involved with a subversive, a traitor? He should have known his own wife better than anyone. He sighed. Instead, the petty officer saluted. "About the burial, sir." Bauer eyed him coldly. "The prisoners will do it. It should dampen anyone else's foolishness." Maleg stared past him at the distant cruiser. They had found no weapons, no demolition charges either. Even the prisoners were harmless civilians. Bauer had enjoyed killing the man, he decided. Given half a chance, he would have gunned down all the rest. Maleg knew about officers like Bauer. Why had he been the one to get saddled with him? The first Arada was being hoisted up from alongside, many hands reaching out to boom it away from the hull as the ship dipped heavily in the surrounding current. Leitner had come down to the forebridge. "Like clockwork, what did I tell you, eh? God, what a coup it will be!" Heckler trained his binoculars on the lonely station. They would land a small party with 2 of the ship's wireless telegraphists. They would have all the right codes, and even if they had been changed by the enemy, no one would question their one frantic call for help. Several things could go wrong, of course. A vessel might unexpectedly arrive on a visit to the islet. If that happened, a prearranged alarm signal would be made and the Prince would be on her own again. Feet clattered on the ladder, and Tyle entered the bridge, his eyes concealed by dark glasses. "Have you selected the men to remain on the islet, sir?" Heckler looked at him. "I have spoken to the doctor, Victor. 3 are still in sickbay after being thrown from their feet." "I have their names, sir. I did think they were malingering." His voice was quite flat and toneless. Heckler turned so that Leitner should not hear. "Are you all right?" "I am. Good. We can land the 2 survivors also." Leitner turned. "When they are picked up eventually, nobody can say we were not humane." Tyle stared past him. "A man was killed over at the radio station." Heckler exclaimed angrily. "When? Why was I not told immediately?" Leitner said, "I was informed. You were busy anchoring the ship, remember?" Tyle had a hand to his chest as if he was in pain, but dropped it as he explained. "Bauer shot one of the mechanics." He waited and added harshly, "A civilian." Leitner swung round again. "In God's name, man, what do you expect? I will not have our people put at risk for any reason. Bauer acted as he thought fit. I will uphold his decision. One bloody shooting is not my paramount concern. Thank you, sir." Tyle eyed him blankly from behind the dark glasses. "Evidently, sir." He turned and hurried from the bridge. "Now what the hell was all that about?" Heckler thought he knew Tyle. Now he was not sure of anything. He said, "Nobody wants to see non-combatants killed, sir. However," Leitner sniffed, "however sums it up, I think." Heckler was suddenly sick of him, even of Tyle. When the latter discovered... He raised his binoculars to watch the party on the beach to hide his sudden apprehension. Suppose Tyle already knew. How could he? As captain, he had been told nothing until Leitner's anger had let the news spill out about Tyle's poor wife. Leitner said, "You can speak to the men you have detailed. It will come better from you." He was calm again, but as their eyes met, Heckler could sense the spite in his casual remark. "Tell them you are leaving them behind." "Why? For Germany? Would it be enough this time?" He gritted his teeth. It was all they had. He said, "Tell the sickbay I am coming down." Heckler walked along the port side beneath the elevated barrels of the anti-aircraft weapons. The lieutenant in charge crossed the deck and saluted. "The boat is ready, sir." Heckler stared past him at the small landing party, 3 of whom were still showing signs of their injuries. It had been a difficult thing to tell them what was required. Heckler knew better than to make a speech. He had explained simply, "It is for us, comrades. The ship." A senior wireless telegraphist was in charge, with 1 other assistant, while the remainder were from the sickbay. "I shall come back for you if I can." He had sensed their efforts to be brave, not to let him down. It was, he thought, one of the hardest things he had ever asked anyone to do. He walked with the lieutenant to the side, where a motorboat was waiting to transfer the small party to the radio station and bring back the others. They were assembled by the accommodation ladder. Heckler shook hands with each one.
He saw the two prisoners already in the tossing motorboat. The old boatswain had stared at him blankly when he had told him he would soon be released. The other one, named Ames, had met his gaze, not exactly hostile, but strangely defiant. He had warned the senior telegraphist about him. He was probably safer off the ship, he thought. Heckler saluted as they climbed down the side, one with a plaster cast on his arm swinging round to stare up at his messmates who waved to him. Suddenly, one of the sailors at the guardrails began to sing. He had a rich, mellow voice, and as Heckler watched he saw many of his men leaning over the rails, their voices joining and rising above the sea and the splutter of the boat below the ladder. Auf Wiedersehen, until better days. Heckler watched the boat until it vanished around the high bows, then walked slowly aft. That must have been dreadful for you. He saw her standing by a screen door, one foot on the raised combing.
It was. I have been thinking about you. Maybe too much.
She said, People, your men think you are made of iron. An iron pirate, did you know that? He looked down at her, studying her mouth, imagining how it would feel trapped in his. She watched his face, his indecision. But I know the real man. He said, After we leave here... He tried again. When we meet with the enemy, I want you safe, no matter what happens. I need to know you are spared the true danger. After the war... Her eyes left his face for the first time. I will not wait that long, Dieter. Heckler climbed to the bridge and walked to the fore gratings. Stand by. Bells jangled and Gudegast said, Course to steer 135, sir. He heard someone murmur behind him, See the poor buggers on the beach, Max? I'd hate to be left. A petty officer snarled, I shall personally maroon you if I get the chance. Stand to, damn you! Heckler felt the sun warming his face through the toughened glass screen. The cable was coming in more quickly now. Clank, clank, clank. Would they ever drop anchor again? He smiled, despite his anxieties. Iron Pirate. The enemy probably had a less colourful name, he thought. He raised his binoculars and trained them over the quarter towards the radio tower. He thought of the unknown seaman's words, I'd hate to be left. Korvettenkapitän Frober, the executive officer, stamped onto the gratings and saluted. Well? Frober shifted his long, ungainly legs. I hate to bother you, sir, but one of my divisional officers has made a complaint. He has threatened... Nobody threatens you, Werner. You are part of my authority, a most important one. The communications officer... Heckler kept his face impassive. It would be Bauer. Frober continued, He claims that the second-in-command entered his private office after forcing the watch officer to give him the key. It hit Heckler like a steel bar. So that was it. He had even ordered Tyle to go there himself. You have told me, Werner. Leave it with me, eh? He smiled, but his mouth felt like stiff leather. Frober bobbed his head, satisfied and relieved. And tell Bauer to mind his manners. Tell him from me. Tyle knew. What might he do? When the sun dipped towards the empty horizon, he was still sitting in the chair, and his question remained unanswered. Peter Younger, one-time radio officer of the SS Radnor Star, was still unused to being on dry land again, and for hours after his arrival with the small party of German sailors he had been light-headed, unsteady on his feet like some dockside drunk. When the raider had weighed anchor and had headed away from the tiny islet, Younger had almost expected that each minute was to be his last. He had seen the rough grave, and had heard what had happened from one of the station's crew. He glanced at the white-bearded boatswain who was sitting with his back to a rock, facing the sun, eyes closed. He could be dead, he thought. He idly watched one German who was strolling up and down the slope, a machine pistol dangling from his shoulder. Mason, the man in charge of the small station, had whispered to him that the place was no longer properly operational, so no regular monitoring or signals would be missed or expected. The enemy had worked it out very well. The man had said that when the German operator made his false signal, someone on the receiving end might realize it was not the usual telegraphist. He had added somewhat condescendingly that only a radio man would understand that. Younger had contained his impatience and irritation. You can say that again, his inner voice had answered. Younger had decided not to share his plan with anyone just yet. It would have to be after the false signal and without giving them time to destroy the transmitter. Younger had measured up the distance he had to cover, had even selected the sailor he would overpower to reach the radio room. The German sailor in question was often on guard duty. He was apparently useless as a cook or anything else with one arm in plaster. Younger licked his lips and tried to relax his body, muscle by muscle. When he considered what he intended to do, he was surprised at his strength and conviction. There was no fear at all. He thought of the torpedo which had blasted the old ship apart, men screaming and on fire, others being carried away by the suction to the same Atlantic grave. This would be for them. The old man, Colin Ames, all of them. With a start, he realized that the old boatswain had opened his eyes and was watching him without recognition. Younger smiled. "Okay, Shiner?" He wondered if he knew where they were. The boatswain said huskily, "What time we gonna eat, Sparks?" "Don't call me that, mate." The eyes did not blink. "You're Peter Younger, that's who?" He nodded, satisfied. "Sparks?" Younger sighed. "Ames is dead. I've taken his place. The Krauts wouldn't let me within a mile of this lot if they knew." He gripped his arm fiercely. Through the ragged jersey it felt like a stick. "Help me. To even the score for the lads, and the old star, eh?" He saw understanding cloud the pale eyes for the first time. "Just tell me what to do, Sparks." He smiled, but it made him look even sadder. "Sorry. I mean, Mr. Ames." Younger sat back on his haunches. It was suddenly crystal clear what he would do. The raider was off to attack the biggest prize yet. It must be really important to leave some of their own people behind. None of them seemed to know where the attack might be launched. It would not be much, but his actions might help to save other helpless merchant seamen. He hoped his old mother would find out that he had died this way. Might get the George Cross. Something for his dad to brag about down at the Shipwright's Arms. A shadow fell across them. "We eat soon." It was the senior operator, apparently the only one who spoke English. "Thanks." The German glanced down at the old boatswain. "He okay?" Old Shiner did not open his eyes. "Right as bloody ninepence, tar." The German turned away. That last sentence had thrown him. He walked down to the water's edge and stared at the dark water. Just a pile of rock in the middle of nowhere, he thought. His name was Ernst Genscher, and his home was in Leipzig. It would be cold there now. Winter always came early to that city. He tried to see it as in his boyhood, the spires and fine buildings, not as on his last leave, the bomb debris, Russian prisoners working to clear the streets of corpses and rubble. How much longer would the war last, he wondered. He and the others would end up in some prisoner-of-war camp in England or Canada. It might not be too bad. Genscher looked at his watch. He would send the signal in a few hours' time, just before sunset. It was somehow appropriate. The three captains sat in Hemrose's deep armchairs and held out their glasses to be refilled. Hemrose watched his steward pause to take Captain Eric Duffield's glass to be topped up. Rhodesia's captain was a big, powerful man whose face had once been very handsome. A bit too smarmy for Hemrose's taste. The lights of Simonstown glittered on the water like a swarm of fireflies, while here and there small boats moved through the dusk between the anchored warships. It could be peacetime, he thought. Well, almost. He heard Duffield say, "Good place to settle down, South Africa. I'd think about it myself after this lot's over." The New Zealand captain, Chantrel, replied, "We've not won the bloody war yet." Hemrose said, "I still can't believe it, you know. A whole ship gone west, not even a scrap of wreckage discovered." Chantrel said, "It happened to HMAS Sydney. Her loss is still a mystery." Duffield said, "The backroom boys at the Admiralty know more than they let on." Hemrose glared. "Bloody useless, most of them. That Jerry is still around. I'll stake my reputation on it." Commander Godson came in and handed a signal pad to his superior. Hemrose had to read it twice, his face shining with sweat as if he had been running.
He said slowly, "From Admiralty, gentlemen. 30 minutes ago, a signal was received from the cable and wireless station on St. George. It reads, 'Am under attack by German cruiser.'" He lowered the pad and eyed them grimly. "There was no further transmission. We may draw our own conclusions." Chantrel exclaimed, "I know the place! Christ, it's northeast of Ascension!" Hrose remained grave and under control, even though he wanted to yell out loud. He said, "Yes, all the time we thought the German was destroyed. Some of us, anyway." Chantrel stood up and knocked over a glass without even seeing it. "What is he trying to do?" Hrose smiled gently. "Do? Who really cares? He probably intended to carry out a last attack before running to some friendly South American bolt hole. Graf's Bay all over again. Capitan Heckler," he spat out the name, "will know that heavy forces are to the north of him. He will head south after this, then scuttle, whether he likes it or not." "Can we rely on that signal, sir?" Hrose looked at him and beamed. "Make a signal to Admiralty, Toby. The squadron is leaving without delay." Thank God he had insisted on fueling from lighters. It would have taken another hour to clear the port otherwise. Later he said, "It must be fate. I knew we were destined to meet. Right from the beginning. I always knew. Settle the score." Heckler came out of his dream like a drowning man fighting up for a gasp of air. Even as he propped himself on one elbow and jammed the telephone to his ear, he knew what it was. The only surprise was that he had been able to sleep at all. It was Frober. "WT office has reported the signal, sir. Right on time." "Thank you. You know what to do. I'll be up shortly." Even now the signal would be flashing around the world. The radar had been verified and slotted into one section of this great ocean. Brains would be working overtime as staff officers rearranged their thinking and defenses. Except that the Prince was nowhere near the small islet and was speeding in the opposite direction. The telephone rang again. This time it was Tile. "Exercise action station, sir?" "Not yet. Let them have one more good meal. It may be the last for some time." Tile grunted. "Dawn attack, sir?" "Yes, as planned, Victor." Shortly after midnight, Heckler made his way into the bridge. That last catnap had driven the tiredness away. Or was it the prospect of action? In the darkness, figures moved towards him, or held motionless at their positions. It was a beautiful night, bright stars and a deep, unbroken swell again. As the time dragged on, the weather began to change. It grew much colder, and the steep swell became visible on either beam as a rising wind broke the crests into ragged white lines. The Prince was built for this kind of weather, and as she dipped her forecastle until spray burst over the stem or sprouted through the hawse-pipes, she seemed almost contemptuous. More signals came in a steady stream. Operations Division sent one signal about a small British cruiser squadron leaving Simonstown. Heckler said, "Action stations in 10 minutes. Tell the supply officer to keep the galley on standby. I want soup and coffee sent around every section until the last moment." Gudagast stood beside his chair. "Time to increase to full speed in 20 minutes, sir." He sounded calm enough. "Good. Sound off." The alarm bells clamoured throughout the ship, followed by a few thuds as the last of the heavy doors were clipped home. Voice pipes and handsets muttered around the bridge, an unseen army. From every gun, torpedo, and magazine the reports came in. Heckler pictured his men within the armoured hull. Down in the sick bay, Stroheim and his assistants would be waiting, their glittering instruments laid out, waiting for the pain and the pleading. As it must have been at Coronel and Falklands, at Doggerbank and Jutland. Heckler jammed his pipe between his teeth and smiled. Trafalgar, too, probably. A voice said, "First-degree readiness, sir." Heckler gripped the rail below the screen and stared into the darkness. They should hold the advantage with the convoy framed against the dawn. The escort had not been identified, which meant that it was nothing important. "Steady. Steer 040. The bows plunged into a deeper trough than usual, and the sea boiled up and over the forecastle as if a broadside had fallen silently alongside. As the ship turned, the two big turrets below the bridge trained across the starboard bow. Without turning, Heckler knew that the two after ones were also swinging round in unison, until all 4 guns were pointing on the same bearing. The sea was still in darkness, so that the leaping crests looked like birds, swooping and falling to appear elsewhere in another guise. "Admiral's on his bridge, sir." "Very well." Leitner had made a suitably timed entrance. Heckler thought of the girl. She had shown no fear, but being sealed below behind massive watertight doors would test anybody. Heckler kept his binoculars sheltered beneath the oilskin until the last moment to keep them dry, but he had seen what the lookout had whispered to a companion. A thin pale line like polished pewter, cold and without colour. Dawn, or nearly so. "Radar bridge!" They all tensed. Then the speaker continued. "Target in sight! Bearing green 45! Range 12,000! Heckler tugged his cap more firmly across his forehead. The peak was wet and like ice. He stood up and let the spray dash over him as he peered towards the starboard bow. They had found them. Now it was up to the guns. "Open fire!"
Peter Younger knelt on the floor of the storeroom where the prisoners had been locked up for the night, and pressed his eye to a hole in the wall where a bolt had rusted away. It was early morning, and he had heard some of the German sailors calling to each other. Old Shiner sat with his narrow shoulders against the wall, idly watching the young radio officer's eyes in the filtered sunlight. "They're making a bloody row," he said irritably. "Couldn't sleep 'cause of it." Younger said, "They broke open a stock of booze. That's what all the racket's about." As soon as the false signal had been made, the prisoners had been herded together. It was as if the Germans had to let off steam, now the reality of their position was out in the open. Mason, the man in charge of the station, dropped down beside him. "It's too late, then." He sounded wary after Younger's outburst during the night when he had told them what he was going to do. He said, "I must try. There's still a chance we might save a few lives, or call our blokes down on the Krauts." Old Shiner said, "If they don't open a bloody door, I'm going to drop me trousers right now." Younger closed his eyes and thrust his forehead against the warm metal until he could think properly again. Poor old Shiner was halfway round the bend. He looked at Mason. "When the guard unlocks the door, we'll grab him and get his gun." Mason nodded unhappily. "It'll be the end of us, you know that." Younger shrugged. "I'm not going to think about it." Mason exclaimed, "He's coming!" He pressed himself to the wall and whispered, "Jesus!" Younger tested the weight of the makeshift club in his hand. It was a length of firewood, probably left at the station for the winter months. He held his breath as the man fumbled with the padlock and tried several times to insert a key. Younger heard him curse and the clatter of the padlock as it fell on the rock floor. "Please, God, let it work!" He flung his weight against the door. It flew back and thudded heavily against the guard's skull as he stooped down to recover the padlock. Younger slammed his sea boot into his gaping jaw. He brought the heavy piece of wood down on his head and wrenched the submachine gun from the man's shoulder. Then he was running towards the rough ladder, expecting at any second to hear a challenge, feel the agony of a bullet between his shoulders. He heard Mason panting behind him, sobbing and muttering to himself as he followed. With a cry, he kicked open the door and saw the German with the plastered arm staring at him, a mug of something in his free hand. The German lunged for his holster, which was dangling from a chair. Younger squeezed the trigger, but the gun remained silent. Safety catch! He fumbled for it, dimly aware that the German had dragged out his pistol, and that Mason was on his knees behind a packing-case, burbling incoherently and in tears of terror. Something blurred across Younger's vision, and he saw a heavy iron bar smash down on the man's plastered arm to crack it like a carrot. The German dropped his pistol and fell to the floor, his lip bitten through as the pain exploded in his shattered arm. Old Shiner, his washed-out eyes blazing wildly, stepped further into the room and swung the long bar once more. It must have taken all his strength, but the German lay quite still, probably dead. Old Shiner tossed the bar aside and snatched the submachine gun from Younger and snorted, "Here, I'll keep them buggers off." With a gasp, Younger sat down before the transmitter, his heart pumping as with a purr of power he switched it on. It was not so different from the one he had trained on. He dashed the sweat, or were they tears, from his eyes and concentrated every fibre on the key. He pressed the headphones over his ears and managed to hold the new sounds at bay. Sudden shouts, the blast on a whistle.
He came out in a rush of sweat. The signal was already being acknowledged. He grinned uncontrollably at the key. There was a rattle of machine-gun fire and a line of holes punched through the wall. Old Shiner had the door open just an inch and the room filled with smoke as he fired a long burst down the slope. "Got one of the buggers!" He was laughing as he crossed to the opposite side. Neither of them even noticed that Mason, the unwilling volunteer, had already been killed by the first shots. Younger winced as more shots crashed through the room, and some exploded the dials and fuses at the top of the transmitter. More crashes, and the transmitter went dead. Younger threw the earphones on the bench and swung round. "We did it!" A window shattered, and he stared without comprehension at a heavy cudgel-shaped object as it fell at his feet. He had not, of course, ever seen a German hand grenade before. When the grenade exploded, there was only darkness. There was less smoke now, and Heckler guessed that the firefighting parties had doused most of the flames between decks. Voice pipes chattered incessantly until Frober shouted, "Damage control, sir!" Heckler jammed the telephone to his ear. Tyle said, "A Flugshell, sir! A shot in a million!" "Tell me." Tyle explained in his flat, impersonal tone. One of the armed merchant cruiser's last 8-inch shells had plummeted down to pierce the battery deck between the bridge and turret Bruno. 16 men of the damage control party had been killed. In such a confined space it was not surprising, but it was a double disaster. The explosion had severely damaged the mechanism of turret Bruno. Until the damage could be put right, the whole turret was immobile. Frober whispered, "The Admiral, sir." Leitner seemed to materialize on the bridge like a white spectre. "What the hell is happening?" He glared through the trapped smoke, his shoulders dark with rain. "I am not a bloody mind reader!" Heckler looked at him coldly. "B turret is out of commission, sir. We've lost 19 men killed and 3 injured. 1 man was blinded." "I do not hear you. What are you saying? We have lost the convoy. Don't you understand anything?" Heckler said, "Radar reports 3 tankers sunk and 2, possibly 3 escorts as well." "I don't care. 3 tankers a pinprick. We should have taken the whole convoy." Jäger waited for Leitner to rush to the opposite side and stammered, "WT office has picked up a signal from the radio station, sir." Heckler eyed him calmly, although his nerves were screaming. "Well, they are not sure, sir, but it seems as if another operator has disclaimed the first signal. Now there is only silence." Leitner was suddenly facing him, his face streaming with rain. "What was that? Am I to be told nothing by these idiots?" Heckler replied, "Somebody on St. George took over the transmitter. Had it been any earlier, we would have had to abandon the whole convoy. Leitner thrust his face so close he could smell the brandy. "I don't want your sniveling excuses. I'll have those men court-martialed and shot, and I'll personally break the officer responsible for the landing party." Heckler stood back, sickened. "It was a risk. We knew it. It might have been worse." "Worse? Worse? I don't see that. A relic of a merchant ship stood against Prinz Luitpold, and because of someone's incompetence we had to withdraw. By God, Heckler, I'll not be a laughingstock because of it. Do you know what I call it?" Heckler pressed his hands to his sides. He wanted to hit Leitner, to keep on hitting him. "I call it cowardice, in the face of the enemy. What do you think of that?" "I can only disagree, sir." "Can you, indeed? There are some who will live long enough to regret this day." He stormed off the bridge, and Frober hissed, "I'm no coward, damn him!" Heckler ignored him. "Recall the Arado. Tell WT to monitor every signal. We have roused a hornet's nest." He looked round, surprised, as sunlight broke through the dull clouds. "And I want the navigating officer here, at once." There was no point in wondering about the hand on the transmitter. It was probably as dead as the men trapped below when the shell had exploded amongst them. A messenger handed him a telephone. Leitner's voice was quite controlled again. It could have been someone else entirely. "We will rendezvous at the 2nd grid point. It will be safer than heading north right away." "Very well, sir." Why don't I argue with him? Tell him that we are wasting sea miles and precious time. Steer north and take the risk. It would be 900 miles closer to home. But even as he thought it, Heckler knew it was fruitless. Leitner was unstable in his present mood. All he could think of was their failure to destroy the whole convoy, the effect it might have on his own reputation. He had made it quite clear that he would see that all blame would rest elsewhere, on the captain's shoulders, no doubt. Heckler was quietly surprised that the realization did not touch him. Tyle entered the bridge and eyed them grimly. "I have done my round, sir." Heckler nodded. "Tell me the worst, Victor." "One of my petty officers' hammer is trapped in the empty ready-use room, sir. The mechanism was broken in the explosion." Gudegast said, "But he should not have been in there, surely." Heckler said, "I have the key in my safe, Victor." Tyle faced him. "Yes, and the Admiral had the other. I'm fully aware of the security arrangements in this ship. He seemed to check himself with a real effort. "Well, he's trapped inside with the Admiral's boxes." It would have to be solved, but against what had happened it seemed trivial. "See what you can do." Heckler looked at each of them in turn. "And thank you." He felt utterly drained, yet he must inspect the immobilized turret, see his heads of department, and bury their dead. He thought of the girl's face so close to his own, the need to see her. It might be the last time. The legend and the luck were no longer enough. Acting Commodore Hrose on board the Wiltshire, with the Rhodesia half a mile astern and the light cruiser Pallas ahead, was pushing on towards Ascension Island when a signal was received from Admiralty. The signal from St. George was a fake. The northbound tanker convoy is under attack by the raider. HMS Tasmania is engaging. A later signal reported that the armed merchant cruiser Tasmania had been sunk, but one escort reported seeing a shell burst on the raider Prinz Luitpold. Most of the convoy had survived. In the chart room of the Wiltshire, Hrose was addressing his officers. "Heckler had that convoy on a plate. He'd knocked out the escort and picked off the first tankers like fish in a barrel. But for the old armed merchant cruiser, he would have polished off the whole boiling lot." The young navigating officer said, "If he's damaged, he'll also need fuel." Hrose nodded. "Good thinking. When his bunkers are topped up, he'll make for safe waters again. My guess is Norway." He added grudgingly, "Even with the home fleet and Force M on the alert, he's the sort of captain who might just pull it off. If he sails safely into port after cutting our blockade in both directions, he would do far more good for German morale at home than by wiping out that convoy." Godson said, "The Germans have been using the big supply submarines in the South Atlantic for 2 years, I believe." Hrose smiled. "Check all the U-boat reports in that area, ours and the Yanks. Then make a signal to Pallas and Rhodesia. I'd like to see the captains before we begin." Godson wilted under his stare, but asked, "And Admiralty, sir?" "Balls to their lordships, Toby. I was given this job, and I intend to see it through." Leitner looked up from his littered desk and eyed Heckler for several seconds. "You wish to see me?" Heckler nodded. "We have just buried the men who were killed, sir." "Yes, I felt the ship slow down. Not that she's exactly a greyhound of the ocean at the moment." "The engine room expects the pumps will all be working at full pressure soon. The rendezvous with the supply boat, sir. I am having second thoughts. At this reduced speed we will meet the milch cow on her final day in the prescribed grid. After that, we may not find the time to refuel before we turn for home." "I had considered that, Dieter, but we still stick to our plans. I intend to transfer the camera team to the submarine. They can make their own arrangements when she reaches Germany." "And the woman pilot?" "Ah, yes, the lovely Erika. I am afraid she has not earned her release just yet." He dragged a chart from beneath a pile of papers. "The rendezvous is here, right?" Heckler bent over the desk. Why go over it again? All he could see were the lines of flag-covered bodies, the rain sheeting down while he had read the burial service. Then the signal to the bridge to reduce speed, the last volley of shots, and the seamen rolling up the empty flags for the next time. Faces and groups lingered in his mind, like little cameos of war itself. A young seaman wiping his eyes with his sleeve and trying not to show his grief at the loss of a friend. The camera crew filming the funeral, a petty officer staring at them, his eyes filled with hatred and disgust. Leitner should have been there. It was the least he could do. And he had seen the girl, too, her coat collar turned up as she had gripped a stanchion below 2 manned anti-aircraft guns, and watched him, listening to his words as he had saluted, and the pathetic bundles had splashed over the side. Heckler had been kept busy with hardly a break. He was dog-tired, at a time when he needed to be at full alert. Leitner was saying, "Now about my boxes, Heckler thought of the petty officer who was still trapped. The damage control section had told him that the door was buckled, and it would have to be cut away with torches. "They are working on the door, sir." "That man had a key. He must have stolen it or made it. He is a thief, a menace to this ship, a traitor. I intend that he shall stand trial as soon as he is freed." He raised his eyes suddenly. "I want that door open. It can be done, yes or no?" He swung round. "What now?" Tyle stood in the entrance, his cap dripping with rain. "The door won't move, sir. The engine room is supplying some heavier cutting gear." "Don't come here with your sniveling excuses. I want the door forced open immediately. Blow it down with a limited explosion." "It could kill Hammer, sir, in such a confined space." "It will save him from the firing squad. He was spying on me, and he's not the only one. Must I repeat everything? Blow it open." Tyle looked at Heckler, his face pleading. "He's one of my men." "I have no doubt of that." "What exactly do you mean, sir?" "Are you questioning me or my orders?" Heckler snapped. "I would like to remind both of you that we are in some danger." To Tyle he added, "Wait outside. I'll deal with this matter." As the door closed, he said, "How dare you accuse my officers of plotting against you? You are supposed to offer leadership to this ship's company, not act like some sort of god." Leitner's jaw hung open. It was as if Heckler had struck him, or screamed some terrible curse. Heckler continued flatly, "I intend to fight this ship back to Germany, and to do that I need the trust of every man aboard. Respect, not fear, sir, is what we survive on, or we go under." Leitner dragged out a spotless handkerchief and slowly dabbed his lips. "So that is your attitude?" "It is." He waited, half expecting Leitner to call to the sentry and put him under arrest. A Luger lay on the table nearby. He might even drag that out and shoot him in his present unstable mood. Leitner nodded jerkily. "I shall remember this. Now, get that door open and have that man arrested." Heckler stepped away from the table. Leitner had again become very calm. It was unnerving. Heckler stepped out of the cabin and found Tyle waiting. "You think I knew, don't you?" I don't understand." "You love this ship, Victor. I know that. In a matter of days, maybe hours, we shall be called on to fight, against odds. I shall need your loyalty then, and so will the prince." He looked away, unable to watch Tyle's despair, as he said brokenly, "She was arrested by the Gestapo. I was not told. If I hadn't read that file—" Heckler said gently, "It was too late to do anything when I found out about it. We were under enforced radio silence, you know that. It may not be as bad as you think. I am the captain of this ship, Victor, and many people probably think I am too remote, too secure to watch minor events under my command. But I have seen and heard things. I will not allow this ship's reputation to be smeared." His eyes were hard. "By anyone." Tyle touched his cap. "I'll do what I can." He swallowed hard. "I wasn't certain. Heckler walked out to the open deck. It was like sharing a terrible secret, to see the tears running down Tyle's cheeks. He felt suddenly sickened by it. By Leitner's inconsistent behavior, his malice and his instability, but more by his own uncertainty. "You walk alone, Data?" She stepped from beneath the gun mounting, her cheeks glowing from wind and rain. He faced her and wanted to fold her in his arms, forget everything but this moment. "I need to talk, Erika." "I know." She gripped his arm. "I shall never give you up." He turned as a messenger bustled up to them and saluted. "From the bridge, sir. The engine room can give full speed now." "Tell the bridge to wait. I'm coming up." He looked at the girl's eyes, needing her to believe him, to trust him, no matter what happened. He said, "I love you, Erika." Then he stepped back and saw the way she lifted her chin. It was as if they had both found a strength they had not previously recognized. As he vanished up the ladder to the forebridge, she whispered aloud, "And you." The deck began to tremble, and she watched the wash rise up alongside as, once again, the bows smashed into the sea as if they despised it. The following morning, with less than an hour left of the prearranged rendezvous time, they made contact with the giant submarine. Tyle, megaphone in hand, watched the lines being fired across, the engineering party ready and waiting to sway the huge fuel hoses inboard and connect them to the bunkers. Tyle kept seeing Heckler's face, the sadness he had shown when he had confronted him about Britta. Nothing seemed to matter anymore. If they reached home, there was nobody waiting for him. Anyway, Leitner would make certain he would climb no further in the Navy. Either way, only Leitner could win. Leitner had known all about Britta. He could have made a signal when they were still in safe waters if he had wanted to help. Tyle was suddenly quite calm. He knew what he was going to do. Aboard the Wiltshire, Hrose sat nodding in the noon sunlight, his cap tilted over his reddened face. The chief yeoman of signals steadied his telescope and said, "Signal from Palace, sir. In contact with your walrus. Message reads..." The yeoman licked his dried lips. "Enemy in sight." Hrose slid from the chair, feeling their eyes on him, as if he had just parted the Red Sea. "Make to squadron, yo. Increase to full speed." He saw the yeoman watching him too, his eyes asking a question. They had been together a long time, and Hrose did not disappoint him. "Hoist battle ensigns." The walrus that spotted the Prinz Luitpold was picked up by the German radar, and Heckler lost no time in launching his floatplane with orders to find the enemy and report back. The big supply submarine had finished its task and was away. A report came through to the bridge that the blocked compartment was almost open. Heckler beckoned to Gudegast. "Call communications and try to discover what has happened to our aircraft." He saw Frober watching him, gauging his own fate, perhaps. "The Admiral, sir." He took the handset. "Sir?" "I have had an important signal data direct from our Führer. Germany is expecting great things from us." He broke off with a curse as the intercom cut through. "Aircraft! Bearing green for 5. A pause, then disregard. Friendly." Someone muttered hoarsely. "About time, too." Heckler held up his hand. "Silence on the bridge." Apart from the wind through the halyards and superstructure, it was suddenly still. Gudegast whispered, "Gunfire." Then they saw the long trail of smoke before they could identify the Arado. The smoke lifted and dipped behind the plane like a brown tail, and Heckler saw the drifting tracks of shell fire which told their own story. The pilot must have dared too much and had gone too close to the other ship, or had been trapped by her main armament. "Stand by on deck to retrieve aircraft." Heckler watched the Arado's desperate progress. Someone was using a hand lamp, so they had been badly mauled, hit with flak enough to knock out their radio. The senior signalman opened his mouth, but Gudegast said, "Signal reads, enemy in sight to northeast. 1 destroyer." He winced as the plane dived and almost hit the water before rising again like a dying bird. 2, repeat, 2 enemy cruisers." Heckler dropped his binoculars to his chest as the Arado lifted towards the sky, staggered, and then exploded in a livid orange ball of fire. Jaeger offered him the telephone, his face ashen. "Sir?" He had to hold the telephone away from his ear as Leitner yelled, "2 cruisers and a destroyer! So much for your reckoning, damn you!" Heckler said sharply, "There are people here, sir. We just lost some brave men." "Don't you dare to interrupt me! The Führer entrusted me with a mission!" He slammed down the handset, and Heckler looked at Gudegast with a wry smile. Not pleased. Minutes later, Tyle appeared on the bridge and stared wild-eyed as if he could barely speak. Heckler faced him, his patience almost gone. This had better be urgent. Tyle swallowed hard. "Is it true, sir? I have just been ordered to load those boxes aboard the spare Arado. The Admiral's aide told me personally. I had just reported that we have forced open the compartment. The bosun and his men did it. I sent Hammer to the sick bay, then I got this order." "Then do it, Victor." He lifted the telephone from its special rack, half expecting there would be no reply. Leitner said, "Under these circumstances, I have no choice. Neither have you. My instructions are to fly immediately to the mainland. The fight goes on." Heckler saw the others staring at him, officers, seamen, young and not so young. All seemed to have the same stunned expression. Disbelief, astonishment, shame. "And my orders, sir?" Leitner shouted. "You will take immediate steps to prevent this ship from falling into enemy hands. Close the shore and scuttle her." Heckler put down the telephone and looked at Tyle. "Load the aircraft and prepare for launching, then report to me." Tyle stared at him despairingly. "Not you too! You of all people!" "We do not have much time left." As Tyle turned in a daze, Heckler added softly, "No, Victor, not me." He crossed to the bridge wing and watched the crane dipping over the catapult. The brightly painted Arado suddenly perched there. He heard her voice on the bridge ladder and said, "No visitors." But she knocked Jaeger's arm aside and ran towards him. "I won't go, do you hear? I won't run away because of that coward." He caught her and held her, his eyes looking beyond her as he said, "Slow ahead, all engines." Then he said, "I am ordering you to leave. I should have guessed, Erica. A hero's return or a hiding place in Argentina. You will take him." He pressed her against his body. "I have to know that you at least are safe." "No! Don't force me." "Please go, now, my dearest Erica, please. My men are looking to me." She stood back, her face very controlled, despite the unheeded tears on her cheeks. Then she said quietly, "You'll not scuttle, Dieter. That's what you're saying." He did not reply directly. "I shall never forget." Then he turned away. "Escort her to the plane." "Radar bridge!" The merest pause. "Enemy in sight!" Heckler barely heard the babble of instructions to the main armament. He strode to the wing and saw Tyle by the catapult, then watched with surprise as Tyson was pushed up into the cockpit behind the girl. "What the hell?" Froebe called. "From damage control, sir! The door to the Admiral's bridge has jammed! A power failure!" Heckler stared at the brightly painted plane, then very slowly lifted his cap high above his head. With a coughing growl, the Arado bounced from the catapult and lifted away from the ship, its wings glinting in the glare. "Full ahead, all engines." Heckler watched the Arado until it turned away and headed towards the western horizon. Froebe said huskily, "The Admiral demands to speak with you, sir." Heckler recalled Tyle's face. He alone must have cut the power from damage control to seal Leitner in his own bridge. "My respects to the Admiral, but I have to fight a battle." When he looked again, the tiny plane had vanished, and yet he could still feel her pressed against him, feel her anguish like his own when they had parted. Heckler leveled his glasses with difficulty as the bridge shook to the vibration. The speaker intoned, "Range 14,000, bearing steady." 2 cruisers in line abreast to offer their maximum firepower. Heckler could see them as if they were right here. The destroyer was slightly ahead. They would sight her first. Heckler glanced around the open bridge. He might be forced to go up to the armoured conning tower, but he would hold out as long as possible. He had been brought up on open bridges, where he could see everything. When their lives were in the balance, it was even more important that his men should see him. Kroll again. "Large cruiser at Green 10." A brief pause. "She's opened fire!" Heckler found that he could watch like any spectator as the enemy salvo exploded in the sea far off the starboard bow. "Second ship's fired! Main armament ready, sir!" Heckler jabbed the button below the screen, and seconds later the 6 big guns lurched back on their springs, the raw and ear-splitting crashes punching at the bridge plating like giant battering rams. The deck jumped beneath the bridge, and a huge column of smoke burst over the side, while patterns of falling debris were lost in seconds in their rising bow wave. The voice pipes settled down into a staccato chorus, reporting, asking, pleading. Heckler heard the taut replies from his bridge team. "Send stretcher bearers! Fire party to torpedo TS! Report damage and casualties!" Froebe shouted, "1 hit, sir! Under control!" The din continued without a break, giant waterspouts rising and fading astern as the Prinz Luitpold tore towards the enemy. Direct hit on left ship, someone cheered. Still firing! Heckler winced as 2 shells exploded inboard and a huge fragment of steel whirled over the bridge to plough down amongst some men at a Refueling gun. He stood back from the screen, tasting bile in his throat as he saw a seaman hacked neatly into halves before pitching down amongst the bloody remnants of his companions. Another hit! Left ship is losing steerage way! Heckler wiped his face. Tell them to concentrate on the heavy cruiser to the right. Shoot! Heckler swung round and saw Leitner, hatless and staring as he groped his way across the bridge. Tile must have returned the power and released him. Leitner seemed unaware of the danger and barely flinched as Kroll's trigger released another shattering salvo from all 4 turrets. "You treacherous bastard! You trapped me!" He peered around and coughed in the billowing smoke. "I'll see you praying for death! It will be denied you!" Heckler ducked as steel splinters shrieked and clattered around the bridge. He shouted, "Don't lecture me! This is my ship! You are the traitor, Andreas Leitner!" He seized him violently, all caution and reserve gone in the din and thunder of gunfire. "You were going to run like a bloody rabbit when you found you weren't your own propaganda hero after all! Captain!" Jaeger was holding out a telephone, his face white as a thin scarlet thread ran down from his hairline. Heckler snatched the phone. It was Gudegast. "We should alter course now, sir." "Very well." Heckler slammed it down. "Hard a port. Steer 010. It would leave the badly damaged ship where she could not interfere and allow Kroll to concentrate on the enemy's heavy cruiser. "Steady as you go." The main armament was trained almost directly abeam, their target hidden in smoke and distance. Heckler dragged himself to a safety rail and squinted to clear his vision. Small, sharp thoughts jerked through him. She would be on her way to safety. 500 miles was nothing to her. He wanted to shout her name so that she would hear him, like a last cry. The hull shivered and flames seared out of the deck below the secondary armament. Men ran from their stations, some with extinguishers, others in panic, and one screaming with his body on fire. Heckler clambered above the rail and waited for the smoke to funnel past him. Then he caught a misty picture in the powerful binoculars, like a badly distorted film. The big enemy cruiser, so high out of the water, was ablaze from stem to bridge. A voice yelled, "Casualties removed and taken below!" He pictured Stroheim with bloodied fingers, his gold-rimmed glasses misting over in that crowded, pain-racked place. A shell ploughed below the bridge, and more splinters smashed through the thinner plating by the gate. Kroll's intercom croaked through the explosions. "Both cruisers have lost way, sir. Shall I engage the destroyer? She now bears red 45. Heckler wiped his streaming face. The destroyer would stand by her consorts. She was no longer any danger. By nightfall... He swung round as men ducked again, and the air was torn apart by the banshee scream of falling shells. Even as he levelled his glasses again, he knew the answer. The flaw in the picture, which even Kroll's instruments had overlooked. The destroyer had zigzagged through a smokescreen, and had fired a full broadside into the Prince. Except that she was no destroyer. She was a light cruiser, which nonetheless had the firepower to do real damage if only she could get close enough. Her 2 heavier consorts had seen to that. Another scream of falling shells, and this time the full salvo struck them from funnel to quarterdeck. Heckler gripped the rail, could feel the power going from his engines, as the engineer fought to hold the revolution steady. Throughout the ship, men groped in darkness as lights were extinguished or passageways filled with choking smoke. Others clung together behind watertight doors, which would now remain closed forever. In his sickbay, Stroheim put down a telephone and shouted, "Start getting these men on deck!" The smoke had even penetrated down there, and spurted through doors and frames like a terrible threat. There were more corpses than living men on the forebridge, and Heckler stared down at himself as if expecting to see blood. He was untouched, perhaps so that he should suffer the most. Gudegast arose, shaking himself from a collapsed bank of voice pipes, dust and paint flakes clinging to his beard, as he stared around like a trapped bear. Heckler heard Tile on the handset. "Come up, Victor. Tell your assistant to take over." He turned and saw Leitner standing in the center of the bridge. He screamed, "Where is Tyson?" "He went in the plane with your boxes." Heckler wondered how he could find words even to speak with him.
Leitner held out a canvas pouch and shook it wildly. "These are mine! All that's left! Someone broke into my boxes, damn you!" He flung the pouch down in a pool of blood, which was quivering to the engine's beat as if it was trying to stay alive. "See?" Heckler watched as jeweled rings and pieces of gold scattered amongst the blood and buckled plating. So that was it. He heard himself answer, "So it was all wasted." "Not quite, you bastard!" The Luger seemed to appear in his fist like magic, and Heckler knew he could not move aside in time. A voice shattered the sudden stillness. "Torpedoes to port!" The explosions were merged into one gigantic eruption, so that it seemed to go on and on forever. Heckler was vaguely aware of objects crashing past him, the sounds of heavy equipment tearing adrift and thundering through the hull between decks. His mind was cringing, but all his skill and training tried to hold on just long enough. The light cruiser must have darted in to launch her torpedoes, while her battered consorts had kept up a ragged covering fire. He knew, without hearing a single report, that it was a mortal blow. Gudegast hopped and limped towards him, his eyes blazing as he exclaimed, "Thought you were done for!" Heckler hung on to his massive shoulder. How long had he been unconscious? He could recall nothing beyond the great gout of fire as the torpedoes had exploded alongside. The Admiral lay on his side, his tongue protruding in a crude grimace. One hand still held the Luger, the other was like a claw, as it reached out for the scattered fragments of his fortune. Gudegast aided the captain to the bridge chair. "He's dead, sir." He watched the anguish on Heckler's profile. There was no point in adding to his pain by telling him that he had seen a bullet hole in the middle of Leitner's back. Someone must have gunned him down deliberately as he had aimed at the captain, when the torpedoes had abruptly ended all their hopes. "The enemy ceased fire, sir." That was Jaeger, a bloody handkerchief pressed to his forehead. Gudegast said, "I'll pass the word, sir." Heckler shook his head. "No, let me. I must do it." He raised his hand to the men nearest him. "Abandon ship." The words to wish them well choked in his emotion, and he heard Gudegast mutter, "Come on, sir. We'll still need you." Heckler tried to stand, but when he gripped the rail he found that he was staring not at the enemy but straight down at the littered water. Floats, broken boats, corpses, and swimmers, some of whom trod water to watch as the heavy cruiser began to roll over. Heckler knew he had hit the sea, and that his lungs were on fire when hands seized him and dragged him into a crowded float. Heckler hooked his arm round Gudegast's shoulder and heard him murmur, "Come on, old girl, get it over with, eh?" It was like a great bellow of pain, an indescribable roar, as with sudden urgency the Prinz Luitpold lifted her motionless screws from the sea and dived. Heckler struggled upright on the float and watched the maelstrom of flotsam, the telltale spread of oil. They were still a long way from home, but those who survived would speak for many years of the prince. He stared up at the first pale stars. The Iron Pirate. The legend. The train was moving very slowly, as if weighed down by the packed humanity which crammed every seat and compartment. Heckler was glad he had been able to find a place by a window. It was hard to believe that the journey was nearly over, that the long train was already clanking through the outskirts of Hamburg. Prinz Luitpold had begun her life in this port. It all seemed so long ago. He glanced at his companions, mostly in army field grey, like the rest of the train, creased, worn out, huddled together for warmth and comfort. He stirred uneasily as his mind explored the past like a raw wound. A year since that day in the South Atlantic when the prince had lifted her stern and had dived. The survivors had been gathered into the British ships, and Heckler had found himself aboard the light cruiser Pallas, the one which had fired the fatal salvo of torpedoes. It was strange, but he had sensed no elation amongst the victors. It had been relief as much as anything. He had learned snatches of the final action, of the British Commodore being killed by the Prince's first straddle, and the New Zealanders' initiative in pressing home the attack despite an overwhelming adversary. Heckler had managed to stay with Gudegast, even after they were transferred to a fast troopship with an armed escort, to be landed eventually in the port of Liverpool. Gudegast had told him of Tile's last appearance, all that anyone had seen of him. As the ship had taken on her final list, with men pouring up from the smoke and fires between decks, several of the survivors had seen Tile returning below, as if going to his quarters. Heckler had asked if he had seemed to be in a great hurry. Perhaps he was trying to retrieve some small item of value from his cabin before he abandoned ship with all the others. Gudegast had shaken his head. They said he was just walking, as if he had all the time in the world. A way out. Remain with the ship he loved, which was finally being taken from him. Heckler thought of the months as a prisoner of war. The camp had been in Scotland, a bleak, lonely place, shared mostly with embittered U-boat commanders. Then one day Gudegast was ordered to leave for another camp in the south. It had been a sad, if unemotional, farewell. They had survived too much for anything more. He had asked Gudegast what he would try to do after the war. The big man had plucked at his beard. Back to the sea. That's all I know. Then he had marched away with some others, and Heckler had saluted, without knowing why. After that it had been a matter of waiting and enduring. Heckler had withdrawn even further from his companions. They seemed alien. Their war was not one he had shared, and he wished that Gudegast was still with him. Heckler had accepted the end of Europe's war with mixed feelings. The time seemed to drag, and yet he almost dreaded his release. He had written to Erika Franke several times at the 2 addresses she had left for him, but had received no reply. His head lolled to the monotonous clank, clank, clank of the wheels, and he stared through the window at some great white humps of land. He saw the khaki uniforms of British NCOs who were directing some tractors and a great army of German workers. He realized with a chill that the humps were all that was left of buildings, whole streets, now mercifully covered with the first snow of this bitter winter. Someone said, "Nearly there. Home sweet home." Nobody else spoke. Home. There was not much of it left. Heckler thrust his fingers into his pocket as if to reassure himself that his pipe was still there. He felt his stomach contract as he realized that the train was suddenly running into the station. Again there seemed to be wreckage everywhere, the platform roof blasted open like bare ribs against the dull sky. The train stopped with a final jerk, and slowly at first, then with something like panic, the passengers spilled out onto the platform. Here and there were signs of occupation. Station direction boards in English with regimental crests on them, the bright red caps of the military police, khaki and Air Force blue, voices and accents Heckler had taught himself to know while he had been in the bag. He stared at the barrier beyond the mass of returning German troops. He came to a halt, his heart pounding. Was this freedom? Where was his courage now? The girl, Erika Franke, stood by one of the massive girders which supported the remains of the station roof and watched the train sigh to a halt. It was the third one she had met this day, and her hands and feet were icy cold. Or was it the awful uncertainty, not knowing? As each train had trundled into the station to offload its cargo of desperate, anxious servicemen, she had seen the reactions of the crowd, mostly women, who waited there with her, like her. Now, as the first hurrying figures approached the platform gates and the line of military policemen, she saw many of the same women surge forward, their pitiful pictures held out to each man in uniform. "My son, have you seen him?" To another, "He was in your regiment. You must have known my men." She wiped her eyes, afraid she might miss something. A young British naval lieutenant with wavy stripes on his sleeve asked, "You all right, Fräulein? I've got a car outside." She shook her head and replied politely, "No, thank you." The girl watched the other wave of figures coming through the gates. Not many sailors this time. She would come back tomorrow. She remembered his letters, bundled together, when she had finally returned home.
It was all like a dream now, and the last flight to Argentina an impossibility. She recalled the moment when she had climbed down from the Arado and into a waiting launch. She had felt nothing but a sense of loss. Even when German consulate officials had opened the boxes to find them full of broken fragments of coloured glass, she had thought only of Heckler, with every minute taking him further away, perhaps to his death. Leitner's aide had had hysterics when he had seen the broken glass. She had heard him shout the name of a petty officer called Hammer. Whoever he was, he must be a very rich man, if he was still alive. The woman with the 2 photographs pressed forward. "Please, sir, tell me, please, have you seen my boys?" The man stopped and took the photographs. The girl felt her heart stop beating. It was Heckler. For a long moment she stared at him without moving, taking in every precious detail. The lines were deeper on either side of his mouth, and there were touches of grey beneath his cap. Heckler said quietly, "I'm sorry, my dear. I have not seen them. But don't lose hope." He looked up and saw her, and the next instant she was wrapped in his arms. How long they clung together, neither of them knew. She whispered, "It had to be the right train." She ran her hand over him as if to reassure herself he was real. He said, "I knew I'd find you, my little bird. Somehow." Some British sailors were waving and cheering as some of their companions boarded another train. Heckler put his arm around her shoulders, and they walked out into the drifting snow. Once he glanced back at the station and the jubilant British sailors. Then he squeezed her shoulders and said softly, "Like us, they're going home."